Every area in all parts of the world has those area-specific urban legends that just refuse to die. Whether the stories are about a haunted asylum on the outskirts of the city, or a creature that lives in the nearby woods, or a ghost that haunts a lonely stretch of road outside of town. There's always a common thread within the tales. No one has ever been to these places, seen the creatures, or witnessed any hauntings with their own eyes. There are members of every generation who still proclaim that they know someone whose brother's best friend's sister went to that haunted house with 13 floors that used real blood and spiders, and is so scary that no one has ever made it all the way through. Those same people will swear by those stories without ever being able to provide a shred of evidence or a name of someone who could provide proof of these claims, simply because everyone around here knows that it's a true story. The storytellers eventually pass the tales on to their children, who modify them just enough to keep up with the changing times. And the cycle continues. I'm as skeptical as anyone when it comes to these stories, seeing as I was like a junkie when I was younger, constantly searching for the most terrifying stories, and whatever area of the country I was living in at the time, made up and I spread stories about haunted pizza parlors in New York, or my cousin's encounter with the Jersey Devil, or how my grandfather encountered a feral human-like demon creature in the woods of Colorado. I even broke the one rule with these stories by putting myself in them. I just took guts in hindsight, because I had to make sure that I always told them the same way. And surprisingly, no one ever called my bluff. And I like to think that I have had some wonderful contributions to various urban legends around the Midwest and northeastern states. I moved around a lot. There was always a surge of joy whenever I would wander the hills to school and hear one of my classmates retelling my stories to another one of their friends, adding little bits here and there like a massive game of telephone. I knew, of course, that the stories were complete fiction, but I stood my ground whenever someone asked me about them. I would even manage to act a little bit, speaking with a shaky voice, or looking scared when I would recount a situation that I supposedly experienced myself. I suppose this aspect of my childhood was what led me to my current predicament, which I will recount in full for the internet to take from it what they will. I've laid this little introduction out as a sort of disclaimer, aimed particularly at those who will call my story into question. Been like the boy who cried wolf for years. But I ask you, with every ounce of honesty and integrity that I have, that this time, the wolf is real. For my introduction, it's probably apparent that I moved around the country quite a bit in my middle and high school years. See, neither of my parents had anything to do with any branch of the armed forces. They didn't tend to hang around any given place for too long. I suppose it had some sort of effect on me, but I wasn't hurt by it or anything of the sort. Growing up, I was a complete ham. I made friends very easily, was often the class clown, and because of that, I was often disliked by my teachers. Again, this was never an issue, as I was usually in another state by the time the next semester rolled around. My friendships were often fleeting, as were any positive relationships that I'd ever had with my teachers. Because of the events that followed, my memory of one teacher in particular was slightly skewed, but I will attempt to give the least biased version of our friendship that I can. Mr. Mays was one of my social studies teachers back in the early years of my high school experience. Being older now, I can understand how horrible children are to deal with around that age, and I respect him to no end for the way that he was able to connect with his students. He seemed like one of us. He talked like one of us. He made pop culture references that were current, listened to cool music, and sometimes he would even say hell or damn while he was giving a passionate lecture about Native American history or something like that. A teacher that swore even a little bit. That was the epitome of cool to a freshman in high school. My memory of Mr. Mays mostly stems from the way that he really got into anything that he was doing. The instance that is still very vivid in my mind was, of course, around Halloween of my sophomore year. Mr. Mays was the kind of teacher that would do those typical decorations around the classroom, smiling jack-o'-lanterns, black cat cartoons, typical and boring in the mind of the egotistical high school students. However, on the 31st of Halloween, when most other teachers were rolling their eyes at the fact that teenagers still took dressing up in costumes on Halloween seriously, Mr. Mays took the whole cool teacher thing to a new level. So we walked into the classroom and were surprised to find the blinds drawn, sheets over the smaller windows, candles lighting the room, a single frowning jack-o'-lantern sitting in a stool in front of the desks. Mr. Mays sat at his desk. He just watched the students come into the class, take their seats. He didn't have to ask anyone to be quiet because the moment everyone walked into the room, they were either too excited to care about petty conversations or too confused to bother with them. The students took their seats as Mr. Mays began his lecture. He spoke quietly to set the mood, and he took a seat on a chair right next to the jack-o'-lantern in the center of the room. "Today is probably my favorite day of the year, class," he said, in this monotonous voice. "Halloween is my favorite holiday, and I want to share with you exactly why I love it so much." One girl raised her hand with a concerned look on her face. "I'm pushing the due date for your papers to next Tuesday," said Mr. Mays, without bothering to look at the girl, who slowly put her hand down, looking around at the other students with a hint of embarrassment. The class erupted in this quiet cheer, and Mr. Mays waited for the inevitable silence. He began his story immediately after the class had calmed down. I will attempt to recreate the amazing story that Mr. Mays had told the class that day, and the way in which he told the story that rendered the horror junkies speechless and the rest of the class terrified. The same girl that had raised her hand to ask about the paper was holding her knees to her chest by the end of it, a look of terror on her face. The important thing to know was what the story was about. See, the specifics slip my mind now, and they aren't too relevant. I'll try to recount the parts of the story that matter the most, but don't hold me to it. Basically, Mr. Mays and his friends set out on a road trip around the country after they had graduated college. They took a truck, loaded it with camping gear, and set out to sightsee for the entire summer. The group went from New Jersey, down the coast of Florida, New Orleans, California, and up to Washington. From there, they went to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, and then back home to New York. This concept of the freedom to travel anywhere had the entire class hooked in an instant. Mr. Mays was the coolest teacher ever in my eyes. But being adventurous college kids, the group didn't bring a map. There were no time constraints, so they just kind of drove in the general direction that they wanted to go. And eventually, they found a town to stay in or someplace that looked interesting. He told us that after spending a week in Colorado, he and his friends had to travel through miles and miles of corn, plains, and more corn. He assumed that they were in either Nebraska or Kansas, and they decided to pool their extra cash and stay in a hotel for the night. They settled into a motel in some town that Mr. Mays could barely remember the name of, when one of his friends realized that they were somewhere near his grandfather's farm. He wasn't entirely sure where it was, but being adventurous college kids, they decided to get a quick refund from the motel and try to contact the friend's grandpa. They were unable to get a hold of the grandpa on the phone, so the group figured that it would be fun to just show up. Mr. Mays' friend was adamant that his grandparents would take them in, feed them without a moment of hesitation. So the group set out with an hour of sunlight and seeking the salvation of a comfortable house to stay in. In Kansas, or Nebraska, wherever it may have been, there aren't a whole lot of natural markers that can guide lost travelers. Any directions given to someone who didn't live around the area basically amounted to go up a couple miles to the corn and take a right down on a dirt road, one to the other corn, and there should be some wheat on your right, so as is most cases in scary stories, the group got lost. Never wanting to admit defeat, they drove into the night, making wrong turns every 5 minutes until they found themselves in a wooded road Mr. Mays' friend was certain that his grandparents lived off of. And Mr. Mays described the road as basically a dark path to hell. I wasn't entirely sure how true this was because he got very excited and a bit ridiculous with his explanation of the trees that almost tried to grab the car and the red eyes of countless animals looking at them from the darkness. Regardless, the typical horror tropes worked in at least most of the class. Everyone was terrified, so the group of guys drove on this dark road for about 15 minutes before they came to a clearing and a small building with lights on. It seemed to be a silo. They figured that, at the very least, the people who lived here would be able to help them find where the guy's grandpa lived. The whole idea of everyone knows everyone in these hick parts of the country fueled his hopes. They pulled up the car near the building, realizing when they were out of the car that it appeared to be the kind of place where one would store a whole bunch of chickens, not a home. Still, the lights were on, so they figured that they would give it a try. They approached the building as a group, looking in the semi-open sliding door to find a big, empty room. Hanging fluorescent lights lit the room like it was daytime. They couldn't see a soul. There were no cars, but one of Mr. Mace's friends was convinced he'd seen someone as they pulled up. So they decided to go inside and see if there was an office or something where someone might still be working. Or why else would they have this huge place lit up like this? There were no doors on the inside of the building. Again, it was just a giant, empty hall. So the group roamed around the property and over towards the silo, and as they got closer, they noticed what appeared to be a cellar door. Now, at this point, I remember Mr. Mays telling the entire class to learn from his idiocy. He told us that he hadn't seen many horror movies before that time, and didn't think twice about approaching a creepy cellar door in the middle of a dark, scary, foreign place. He said that approaching the door was one of his biggest regrets. Mr. Mays let the whole class know that he was going to tell us as much as he deemed appropriate about the experience. He felt that we were mature enough to handle it, but advised anyone that was squeamish to leave the class early. Though several students quickly gathered their things and walked out the door, a couple of them being stoners who saw this as an opportunity to go smoke behind the school before the next class. I didn't even give the announcement a second thought. And like I said, I am a sucker for this kind of stuff. And Mr. Mays was telling a story better than anything I had ever conjured up. I wanted to learn from this guy, even though I didn't believe much of the story. After the class had thinned a bit, Mr. Mays continued with the story. He told the remaining few that he and his friends opened that cellar door, releasing a smell that he only described as the most putrid thing my senses have ever experienced. The group was no longer concerned with finding the owners of the property, but was now set on finding the source of that smell. They went down the steps into the cellar, which was lit by a single bulb spaced sporadically along the ceiling for this long hallway. No one ever spoke. Things had gotten too strange. The walls were lined with metal sheeting similar to the roofing on farms. The hallway itself was crooked. The ceilings constantly lowered and rose like a tunnel that had been hastily dug and then never touched up. There were sections where the boys had almost crouched in order to pass. The worst part, Mr. Mays told us, was that the light bulbs continuously flickered, sometimes acting like a strobe light and making it very difficult to move through the winding and unstable hallways. In hindsight, he was certain that his mind was playing tricks on him, but he remembered seeing flashes of things that couldn't be there. He said that when you're that focused on something, or if you're that nervous, your mind can do that to you. It can simply revolt, showing you things or people that aren't there. He continued to describe the hallway, and I was on the edge of my seat. The halls were windy and seemed to go on forever. Mr. Mays guessed that they were somewhere under the creepy forest that they had driven through when they found the door. He couldn't be sure. He said that they came upon a door after walking for what felt like a mile. It was simple and wooden, but it looked like it had belonged outside of a suburban home. It had a nice design, seemed to be freshly painted red, and had a very nice knob and knocker on it. It was a door that belonged to the entrance to a nice house, not one that was sitting in a dirt tunnel in the middle of nowhere. His friends walked towards the door, moving carefully because the flashlights and the bulbs, increasingly uncertain about the stability of the surrounding walls. He turned to the group, the rest of which were nervous at the very least, and he attempted to lighten the mood with a laugh before he said, "I should probably knock first." Mr. Mays' friend grabbed the steel knocker and hit it against the door several times. Quietly uttered, "Anyone home?" The group waited about 30 seconds before their tension broke. The guy next to the door shrugged his shoulders and went to walk back to his friends, but as he did, the light bulb between them surged and exploded. The boys shielded their eyes and looked back to their lone friend by the door. As he lowered his hands, one of the metal sheets of the makeshift roof dropped. The edge of the sheet fell directly on the boy's forehead, slicing it open and sending a wave of blood down his face. The impact apparently knocked him out, and he fell back against the door, knocking it open in the process. The entirety of the group rushed through the dim light to his friend, barely noticing the seemingly pitch-black room that now lay before them. Mr. Mays was the first to make it to his friend's side. He lifted the guy's head onto his shoulders and immediately taking off his jacket and putting it over his forehead in this attempt to stop the bleeding. Once the group had calmed down, Mr. Mays noticed that the arm that had been bracing his friend's head was soaking wet. He was confused about this, and he was attempting to sort it out when one of his friends started talking. He said something about the lines of the lights, and they had to go. When Mr. Mays took notice, "You know when you turn off a light," he told the class, "and everything is almost pitch black except the light of the bulb dying, cooling down. It was like that. There was so many of them. These 20 light bulbs had lit the room seconds ago, and now only looked like little stars in the darkness. That was definitely terrifying. But that wasn't the scariest thing. There was still a very dim light coming from the hallway behind them. And though it was weak, it lit the room just enough to see the 10 people standing less than 10 feet in front of them. Mr. Mays' friend went to say something else as one of the bulbs to their right flickered to life. Now let me interrupt this at this point to say that Mr. Mays was a generally playful guy. He had that tone of voice that makes you want to respond. You know, basically he could say, "Let's go jump off a cliff, guys," and you would want to respond with, "All right, Mr. Mays, show us the way." And that's a ridiculous statement, but it gets to the point across. You know, he was a charismatic guy. The whole story up to this point had been like a campfire story. Yeah, the voice inflections of someone attempting to be mysterious and scary, which worked, were noticeable. At this point in his tale, I could recall the change completely. He was no longer attempting to spook anyone. I could tell that this section was difficult for him. Either he was a very good actor, or it was really a terrifying memory for him to relive. He told us that the light bulb came to life and illuminated the group of people in front of him. In the dim light, he could see children. At least 20 of them in just the visible light. They were all dressed in nightgowns that looked to be tattered and torn, stained dark with something. Their hair was long. Every single one of them looked like they had not had a haircut since birth. Some of the children were almost completely obscured by the length of it. Every single one of them. They didn't appear to have seen a shower or a nice bath in their entire life. Mr. Mays told us that the most terrifying part of the whole thing was that none of the children were moving. They were all standing, staring. Most of them visible from the faint light reflecting off their eyes. His whole group was paralyzed with fear for several seconds when they heard what sounded like an animal in the distance yelping. The way it was described was like the sound of a dog crying, multiplied by 10. It spurred the group to life, and just as the children began to step forward, his friends grabbed the injured one and lifted him up out of the room and into the hallway in an instant. Mr. Mays took another second to move and had difficulty finding his bearings. He reached to his left in an attempt to find a wall to lean against it, ended up finding a handle. Then he pulled hard. Never losing his vision on the children, he bolted for the door right as he noticed what he had grabbed onto, a shower head protruding from a cement wall, reaching maybe a foot into the room. There was something leaking from it, but it was too dim to tell what it was. He realized that it had been leaking onto him, but he didn't care. There was now children stammering towards him as he animal cried in the distance, and his friends were seriously injured. He left the room, and he made a point to emphasize that he could make out several more shower heads on the wall near the single dim light bulb. This is why I call them the showers, Mr. Mays told the class. I was transfixed, sitting as far forward as my desk would allow, bracing for more. I slammed the door right behind me, he said, and I ran through the hallway faster than I could have ever run before or since. I made it back to the car. We drove out of there like a bat out of hell, and a couple of students snickered at the use of the word hell. So when you're trick-or-treating tonight, make sure that you know exactly where you're headed, and don't go out to any abandoned farmhouses. I mean, there aren't many houses here, but you're all smart kids, except Jerry. The class laughed, and the mood lightened as the bell rang for passing period. Mr. Mays turned the light on, reminding them about the paper due next week, and told us to have a safe and happy Halloween. Students all around me were abuzz with theories about the story that they had just heard. I bet it's some kind of crazy Nazi hideout, said one girl. I think it's all ghost babies that were killed by a dog, said another. I couldn't theorize in the slightest. I was still caught up in the moment. The way that Mr. Mays had told the story and the detail that he included in it, it left me feeling like we didn't get the whole story. A couple days later, staying after class and asking him about how it really ended and what happened to his friends, he laughed, said that his friend was fine, that it was, honestly, he whispered this part probably due to some of the drugs that they were on at the time. Mr. Mays winked at me as if to say, don't tell anybody about the drugs bit, kid. And I smiled and I left. I lived in that town for another couple of months, and then we rapidly moved halfway across the country to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Twisted the story around. I told it around the campfire as I got older, and it was always a hit. But I always changed the ending, letting the friend die of blood loss or being dragged away by the children. It wasn't until college that I got a chance to talk to Mr. Mays again. I went to college in northern New York, not for any reason associated with the story. College was fun. I continued being the same ham that I'd always been. It wasn't until sometime around junior year that I ran into Mr. Mays at a bar that I frequented. Initially, I couldn't be sure that the person I saw laying with his head buried in his arms at the bar was Mr. Mays. The only trait that grabbed my attention was a sweater that he used to wear on his birthday during class. The shirt simply read, "I'm the birthday boy." I told my group of friends to grab a table, and that I'd join them in a second. Then I walked over to a man at the bar. "Mr. Mays?" I said. And the man looked up. The man took a second to look at my face before he smiled, put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Hey there, son. How have you been?" I could smell some strong whiskey on his breath. His cheeks were flushed, and the look in his eyes told me that he was 3 sheets into the wind. I had no idea who I was. "Hey, Mr. Mays, it's me, Jack. I was a student of yours a couple semesters, about 6 or so years ago." His face changed a bit, and a genuine look of recognition set in. He took a calmer tone, he smiled, he said, "How have you been, Jack?" We talked probably a solid 20 minutes. I told him what I'd been doing for the last several years. He told me, and apparently he was still teaching in the same school, doing the same old shtick, as he called it. I asked him if everything was all right. He said they were as good as they were ever gonna be, and as good as they were ever been. It took me a while to realize that I was an adult that was having a conversation with another adult. Every time I had spoken to Mr. Mays previously, I'd been in the student-teacher relationship, and now I was a guy having a drink with a friend at a bar. My friends eventually left. I continued to drink with Mr. Mays. He told me all about his divorce, his kids, things that I never would have cared about previously, but now I cared. He was a real person to me, not just some idol anymore. This was a guy who had real problems, not the infallible teacher that I once thought he was. It had been several hours before I even brought up his story about the showers. I told him about my history with urban legends and scary stories, and he just laughed. When I mentioned the story that he had told us years ago, he almost seemed uncomfortable. He finished his whiskey, signaled for another, and then he turned to me and he got very serious. Listen, Jack, I don't know why I kept telling that story year after year. His words were slurred and my hearing was messed up, but we both were sufficiently blitzed at this point. That was what my therapist told me to do when I was younger. I had to tell people it, to come up with a way to get to grips with it or some shit. He took a big swig from his drink. "It's your therapist," he said. Mr. Mays laughed heartily and he looked at me. "Of course, Jack, you think something like that wouldn't fuck a person up?" I was confused, but I smiled nonetheless. Things had gotten very strange. But I mean, you said that you were on drugs or something, right? No one was too terribly hurt. You were all okay, right? He got almost cartoonish with sadness in the next several seconds. "Of course we didn't, Jack. Why do you think I'm here right now?" I was puzzled, quickly filled with 1,000 questions that I wanted to ask him, but I let him carry on. "Tim, fucking, he didn't make it, Jack," he laughed. His laugh turned suddenly to tears. "Fucking took him, he did. I don't even know. Cops told us that we were just drunk. That he wandered off, got taken by wildlife. He didn't know. He didn't see it, Jack." I was absolutely stone-faced at this point. Mr. Mays was carrying along like I knew the actual story, but I didn't. His friends disappeared. I didn't know. I wish they'd found his body, though. Then we could have shown them, he sighed. "It's a bad place, Jack. I don't know anything else to say. It's a bad place." He carried on for a few minutes with his friend, the fun that they had before they went on that trip, and I let him talk. It was only a few minutes later that his phone rang. "Oh, sweetheart," he spoke into the phone. "I'll be out in a few seconds." He gagged. "Love you, baby." The person on the other end of the phone hung up, and Mr. Mays got up to leave. "It's been nice seeing you, Jackie. You got a good head on your shoulders. Make sure you use it." I began to walk out of the bar, and "Mr. Mays!" I yelled after him. "Yeah, Jack." He turned back towards me. "Where'd you say all that showers business took place?" "Where? Hell, didn't I mention it? It's somewhere outside of Broken Bow, Nebraska. It's fucking hell on earth, if you ask me." Mr. Mays walked out of the bar after waving to me, running into the wall before eventually finding the door. That was the last time I would ever see him. I'd never been able to tell him the impact that he had on my life. Or rather, the impact that his story had on me. He'd never know about the trip we took after graduation, almost mimicking the one that he and his friends had made. He'd never know that the things he saw at that place were real. You know why? I mean, he died. About a month later, his liver failed on him. It's all right, though, because his family was with him in the hospital room. He got to die around people that cared about him, and that's all I can ask for from a man like that. I experienced that place too, several years later. It's where my story turns. The following is a story of how I came to find the showers, and why I'll never, ever go anywhere near Nebraska ever again. I'll finish the story when I'm sober. The memory is clear enough. I'm awake now, semi-sober and ready to finish this up for you guys. The internet, and whoever else cares, I guess. I didn't find out that Mr. Mays had passed away until a couple months after the funeral service. Initially, I was going to seek out his family in order to send my condolences, but it wasn't as if Mr. Mays and I were best friends or anything like that, so I refrained. I continued through my college career and graduated a year or so after our bar meeting. Graduating with English as my major wasn't a mistake, but it wasn't exactly... wasn't exactly something that landed me any sort of immediate job after college. Now, I had saved a pretty solid amount of money while I was in school and decided that I deserved a bit of a vacation, if you will. I took my spare cash, got together with a college buddy, Steve, packed up and hit the road, aiming for somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. I had lived in Littleton, Colorado when I was younger and remembered loving the area, so this destination was as good as any. The trip was a success. We made it around Estes Park, Colorado, and found a cheap cabin that we rented for about a month. The days were filled with lounging, hiking, generally things that involved little to no work on our parts. After our rental was through, we packed up again and headed on our way back east. Now, sometime during this trip, we had met up with a couple Estes Park natives in one of the local bars. We never typically hung out with them or anything like that, but we had just had conversations now and then over drinks and food. One night, these guys were paying their tab and packing up to leave awfully early, and they were usually there until the wee hours of the morning. When we questioned them about it, they told us that they had headed to a little get-together with some friends of theirs, and they invited us. Having nothing else to do, we hopped in the car and followed them to the party. The party itself was very low-key and ultimately very inconsequential to the story. However, the important thing about it was that at some point in the night, we were all sitting around the fire and swapping ghost stories. At this point in my life, I wasn't very much of a ham, as I was in my younger years, but with a little bit of encouragement, I started on a couple of the stories that I remembered telling in my youth. Eventually, I made it to Mr. Mays' story about the showers. Every time that I had told it after hearing it from Mr. Mays, I had spiced it up a little bit, but as some sort of subconscious respect for my former teacher, I went straight into the version that he told my class in my sophomore year of high school. The group enjoyed my stories, for the most part, the showers being the mutual favorite amongst the partygoers. Steve and I left for the cabin about maybe 5 in the morning, and he asked me about the story on the drive home. I told him all about Mr. Mays and the class and my love for everything horror-related and whatnot, and he suggested that we try to find the place on our return trip to New York. Initially, I was reluctant simply because I didn't feel like aimlessly wandering through Nebraska for days, looking for some old farm building that was probably demolished at that point, but a couple of days before we left Colorado, I told Steve that it sounded like fun. We weren't going to be able to do another trip like this for a long time, so I figured that we might as well make the best of it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought of it as a little tribute to Mr. Mays. The guy that, in retrospect, helped me realize that I wanted to be a writer. We left Colorado and we made a long, boring, and barren drive to Broken Bow, Nebraska, or hell on earth, as Mr. Mays had put it. We found a motel in town, we hung around for a couple of days, venturing out 100 miles or so in any given direction each day. I remember that Mr. Mays telling us that it was somewhere outside of Broken Bow, but I don't think he got any more specific than that. We tried asking the townsfolk if they had any information about the showers, but we were usually met with blank stares or eye-rolling when we told them what exactly this place was. The only person who seemed to know anything about it was an elderly woman who worked at this gas station on the outskirts of town. I don't recall her name, but this woman was just one of those cheerful old people, very helpful, generally interested in what anybody had to say to her. Steve had started talking to her at checkout, and she asked about our license plate, commenting that we were very far from home. We had nowhere in particular to be, so Steve and I ended up talking to this woman for about 15 minutes, at which point we brought up a hunt for this place known as the Showers. Initially, the name didn't ring any bells, which made sense, seeing as Mr. Mays had just given it the name after his experience there. But when I began to describe the details, ones I remembered from the story, the friendly old woman interrupted me. Her tone was not scornful or mean in any way, but she became very terse and deliberate with her words from that point on. People don't deal with anything related to that sort of business around here anymore, she told us. That was all a long time ago. Following her statements, she attempted to be cheerful again, excusing herself to the restroom, wishing us the best on our return trip to New York. Steve and I returned to the car without a word, both of us were thinking about what the lady had said. Again, she didn't seem to be angry at all. She just didn't want to hear another word about it. Now, we were driving back to the hotel before Steve said anything. I mean, if I had to live in a place associated with an urban legend or anything like that, I would totally mess with anyone who asked about it, he said. I mean, eventually, you just get tired of people asking about it, and so you just try to scare them to get them to shut up, wouldn't you? I agreed with Steve, and I kept driving. The whole experience wasn't sitting right with me. This was some sort of well-known legend in the area. Why didn't no one else in the town seem to know anything about it? But I managed to shrug it off. Mind you, neither of us were scared of finding the showers. This little excursion on our road trip was more like a scavenger hunt, a cap-off to an overall relaxing vacation. Steve and I were basically like tourists, hunting for the site at which a famous movie was filmed or something like that. We went into the whole situation with little to no expectation, and a fleeting hope that we would be able to find this place. We spent another day in Broken Bow before we took our next trip out to find the showers. Nebraska isn't as terrible of a place as people make it out to be, but it really isn't all that exciting. We found a bar, we spent some time there, and that was just about the extent of our activity on our day off. When we did get back on the road, we decided that we would attempt to stay off the main road for as much of the day as we could. Now, I knew that was no way that this place was going to be off the highway, and I remembered some detail about a dirt road in Mr. Mays' story, so we went looking for those. This is a fairly futile effort. See, most of Nebraska is just dirt roads. It was 7 a.m. when we came upon a small but thick forest. I use this term lightly, but for Nebraska, this place was like an oasis. The trees were full and thick, shrouding most of its insides in darkness. The sun was setting, and even though we had run into a few of those random crops of trees, we agreed that this one showed more promise than any of the others. It wasn't really a road, but there looked to be a path where a dirt road might have been at some point. So we drove along that. If the car was able to handle the Rocky Mountains, I'm like, a dirt path in Nebraska would be no trouble. We moved slowly and carefully along this trail, making sure to clear any fallen trees from the road or rocks that would render the car useless. When the sun finished setting, it was pretty dark in this place during the day. When the night came, that was something else entirely. I had an inkling at this point that we had found the right place, but I didn't want to jinx it. So we continued onward. I didn't realize it at the time, but the little bits of light that managed to penetrate the canopy in this miniature forest actually did make it look as if the tree's branches were trying to grab the car, just like Mr. Mays had mentioned in the story. I'm still convinced that he made up that part about the animal eyes, though. The most aggressive creature in the woods that we saw was a dead rabbit on the side of the trail. It didn't have any obvious signs of death. It just looked like it simply laid down and never bothered to get up. We drove around in the darkness for quite a while before we found a clearing. We had to move several smaller clusters of branches out of the way before... But right in front of our exit was a giant, dead monster of a tree. There's no way that we're moving this one. So we got out, turned on the bright headlights in hopes of maybe illuminating the area in front of us. Now there was this feeling of excitement mixed strangely with fear when I saw what lay 50 feet beyond the clearing. There, lit partially by the headlights of the car and a little bit of light from the crescent moon, was what appeared to be an old barn house. This wasn't a typical farmhouse. It was larger than the barns that I'd seen in films and didn't have any sort of crest. It basically looked like a small warehouse. I wasn't entirely sure at this point if this was the place we were looking for, but this was definitely the closest that we had come. I moved through the brush until I was roughly 20 feet from the entrance, at which point all the growth seemed to stop. Now, I don't know if the owners had done something to the soil, but the whole structure had a border around it that was clear of any sort of plant life. I approached the entrance to the building, a large sliding door, as Steve came up behind me with 2 flashlights in hand. So you're just going to run off of the place in the dark? He laughed. I gave a half-hearted chuckle and grabbed one of the lights from his hand. Mine was a little but pretty bright flashlight. It was the kind that hikers would most likely fasten to their backpacks just in case they were stranded at night. It worked well enough. I grabbed the metal door with both hands, holding the flashlight with my mouth, and gave it a tug. It moved slightly, creaked a little bit, but there was no way I was doing this by myself. Steve came up behind me and set his flashlight on the ground. He grabbed the door and said, 1, 2, 3! We pulled at the door with all we could muster. Once we had managed to move it a couple of inches, it must have latched back onto its track because it slid very easily, stopping hard with a loud echoing thud when it completely opened. Steve picked up his flashlight and walked behind me. I had already moved inside. The inside of the structure was exceptionally bare, almost troublingly so. I wasn't entirely sure how far we were from the nearest home or small town, but I wasn't entirely sure how far we were from the nearest home or small town, but there wasn't even the slightest bit of evidence that anyone had been in this building for years. There were no broken beer bottles or empty bags of chips. There weren't even any animal droppings or eager plants that managed to grow up here. The room was expansive, larger than your average farm, but not the warehouse-sized monstrosity that I believed Mr. Mays had described in his story. I was sure that it was simply a holding area for farming equipment or something similar at some point. So disappointed, I wandered near the entrance while Steve ventured into the expanse of darkness. As I was running over the details of the stories in my mind, something stuck with me like a sack of bricks. In Mr. Mays' story, there was a silo near the barn. I ran outside, my eyes adjusting easily because at the very least it was brighter outside. I looked in all directions, running around the perimeter of the building. Surely, if there was ever a silo near this place, there would be some evidence of it somewhere, but despite my hopes, there was nothing. There was nothing but a cluster of thick bushes on one side. Brush, dirt everywhere. And the forest that we had come from. I walked back into the building, frustrated and tired. Steve was still excited, eagerly running around the inside of the building. Even if I could just find a shower head or a pipe, he said, then we'd know that it was true. Just keep looking with me. I didn't want to ruin his excitement. I told Steve the story several times, but obviously he didn't realize that this just wasn't the place. The building was weird, yeah, and it's out of place, oddly pristine, but it wasn't the location of the showers. I let him explore for a little bit before I called him over. This was probably as close as we're going to get, man, I said, but this isn't it. Remember the silo? His face went from excitement to disappointment in an instant, much like a young child who didn't get the presents he wanted on his birthday. I patted him on the shoulder. This was pretty cool, though. I mean, you'd still tell people we found it. I was reverting back to my old habits quickly. Steve laughed. Yeah, man, I guess we could. It's definitely creepy, though. We should get some pictures as proof, you know? I agreed with him. I'm gonna grab the camera real quick, he said as he bolted out the entrance of the building. I was left alone in the building. It was very quiet. And I was alone in there. I could hear the faint sound of Steve running through the brush into the car, but once he was far enough away, eventually, everything was quiet. I remember not even hearing wind or the chirping of crickets as I walked deeper into the dark, flashlight in hand. I was convinced that there had to be something. As I approached the far corner of the room, the sound of my feet scraping against the dirt was interrupted by a soft, hollow thud. I stopped trying to figure out what it was. I put my foot down hard against the ground and heard it again. I stomped one more time, realizing the floor that I was standing on was covering something hollow. I walked through the wall of the room, looking carefully at the floor to try to spot any holes or gaps, and as far as I had known, it was solid ground this thing sat atop, so I was convinced that I had found a hatch or a basement or something. I heard Steve coming back through the brush, and I shouted, "Steve, come over here! It's a hole." As I was trying to say the word hollow, I hopped a bit, hoping to recreate the sound so that he'd be able to hear it upon entering the door, and the second that my feet made contact with the floor, it gave way beneath me. The memory of the fall is fuzzy, but I do recall hearing wood splinter. I remember seeing the light from Steve's flashlight falling away into complete darkness. It wasn't a long fall, but I must have fallen into a terrible position because I know that I lost consciousness for several seconds at least. When I awoke, I was staring at a bright light. For an instant, I thought about approaching the fabled light at the end of the tunnel. I was angry at myself. You died in Nebraska, Jack. How do you know? Wow, you do know how to fuck up. My self-depreciation in the afterlife was interrupted by what sounded like Steve's voice. Jesus, Jack. Jack, can you hear me? Dude, wake up. Please wake up, he screamed. I managed to lift my head off the ground just enough for him to celebrate. The pain in my head was immense, but it was outweighed by the pain shooting through my knee. I knew I had a concussion, but the pain in my knee, oh God, it was so much more pressing. I looked around until I found my tiny flashlight and sat up and reassured Steve, I'm okay. It just hurt my knee. I bumped my head too, really hard. Thank fuck, man, I thought you were dead. Imagine that, though, dying in fucking Nebraska. That'd be awful. His words made me laugh a little, but I stopped myself. The slightest shaking hurt my head and made me incredibly dizzy. I guess a rope? Steve? What? I asked quietly. Should I get a rope to get you out of here, or do you see a ladder? I looked around the walls that sat in front of me. They were smooth cement. There's no way that I was climbing out of here. Yeah, get a rope, I told him. It's buried under all of our stuff, I think. It might be in the red climbing bag, but I'm not sure. Steve nodded, telling me to hang on there and that he'd be back in a little bit. Then he ran off. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. After the sound of Steve's feet scraping the floor above me faded, I was unable to hear the buzzing that occurs in total silence intertwined with a pulsing in my head. I pushed myself over to the nearest cement wall and braced myself against it, resting and breathing deep in an attempt to calm myself. The cement was unnaturally cold against my back. It was summer. I only had a t-shirt on, but it felt like ice, even through that. Again, this observation was primarily made after the fact. A moment, it just felt good to lean against something. I sat there, waiting for Steve in this underground basement, and I began to feel uneasy. I felt like an idiot for falling down here. I felt pain from my injuries as well. That all seemed to fade into one emotion in an instant when I heard what I could only identify as breathing somewhere to my left. I convinced myself that if it was my injured mind playing tricks on me for a few moments until my mind decided to rapidly replay Mr. Maze's story. When I had first heard it in the classroom years before, I was more impressed than I was scared. But now, sitting in this dark basement in the middle of Nebraska, I felt something that I hadn't felt in a long time. It couldn't even be summed up in the word fear. As I sat there, I felt all-encompassing dread. I pointed my flashlight to my left. The direction from which I thought I heard the sound. The light didn't reach the other wall. It was too far away, but I was comforted to see absolutely nothing there. I breathed deeply for a couple more seconds before I heard another noise in the darkness. It was very quick. I can't be sure that it wasn't my own body moving around without me noticing, but I thought that I heard scraping sounds. Not 10 feet from me. It sounded like the noise your feet make when you're walking across a dirt-covered floor. And before I could react, I heard the breathing to my left again, closer this time. There was no way this was real. I hadn't seen so much as a spider web in this building, and now I was convincing myself that something was next to me, and it was breathing. I was angry at myself for getting so worked up. I told myself that the human brain is constantly hallucinating. I told myself that while in silence or darkness, the brain will still make sounds up to fill the gap, to make you think that you see things that aren't there. I channeled my inner skeptic in order to calm myself. It worked. It worked until I saw a flash of something in front of me. I can't be entirely sure of what it was. But I heard the accompanying sound of feet scraping against the floor, and I began to swell with dread. I decided that the best course of action was, at this point, it was to turn off the flashlight, assuming that if it couldn't see me, they couldn't get to me. Whatever they might be. I turned off my flashlight, and I was left in complete total darkness. The bulb of the flashlight faded and cooled as I put it in my pocket, simultaneously pushing back against the cold cement wall in an attempt to stand. I managed to get up on my foot. I found that I couldn't stand to put any pressure on the injured knee. I limped to the corner, humming to myself, trying to break the deafening silence. I called for Steve as loud as I could manage, but I heard no response. He was probably in the back of the car, still hunting for that rope. There had to be a ladder. There had to be a ladder or something somewhere. I continued to hum, and my heartbeat, which had been beating almost out of my chest, slowed to a manageable rate. I moved along the cement wall, keeping my whole body against it and the weight off of my injured knee. I had traveled what I guess to be maybe 10 feet, and my head made contact with something in front of me. I tumbled to the ground. My concussion must have been amplifying the pain because it was blinding. I reached both hands to my forehead when I felt something warm and wet with my fingers. I searched for a cut anywhere on my forehead, but I couldn't find one. I desperately searched for my flashlight as I sat up and tried to get back against the wall. I grabbed the light in my right hand. I braced against the wall with the other, turned it on, and pointed it into the darkness where I was just lying. And there the floor was wet. The dirt had mottled the color of whatever the liquid was. I tried to get my eyes to focus on the puddle, tried to convince myself that it was my blood when I saw another drop fall into the puddle. Words lack the ability to describe the way I felt when I heard the drip noise again. I saw yet another tiny ball of liquid fall into the puddle. I think I knew even then exactly what the source was, but I was endlessly trying to convince myself that I was wrong. I lifted the flashlight up and pointed it at the source of the liquid. What stared back at me was a pipe. A pipe that protruded at least a foot out of the cement wall. The metal was rusted, cracked. Little bits of liquid began to seep from them. At the end of the pipe was a simple shower head, aimed down towards the ground. You know that feeling when your stomach drops? I think mine literally did, because I vomited immediately. I got it all over my shoe, but that wasn't the least bit important at the time. I ignored the pain in my knee and I shuffled along the wall as fast as I possibly could. I heard noises, but I couldn't be sure if it was just the sound of my own movement or something around me. I managed to duck under the next shower head. This one was higher up on the wall and seemed to be leaking the same liquid that the other one was. I felt like I was moving along something infinite. Even now, then I would have to duck or move under another metal bar, another shower head. They began to pour some more profusely, but the liquid was too thick to come out easily. The room began to smell. I remember immediately the way that Mr. Mays had described it. I grabbed my shirt and I put it over my nose. I tucked onward. It didn't stop the smell for an instant. It smelled like vomit. It smelled like shit. It smelled like burnt hair. It smelled like rot. I was still moving against the wall when I fell onto some sort of outlet. I hit the dirt hard, adrenaline coursing through my veins, the pain still managing to break through. My flashlight still in my hand. I aimed it and I examined my surroundings. Sitting in front of me was a doorway. There was a door there, though. It looked aged now. It had a nice little design on a doorknob, a knocker, and it looked like a snarling demon. Red paint was peeling from it, flaking off, falling to the ground in front of me. I clumsily rose and busted through the door, narrowly missing a piece of hanging sheet metal in front of me. And I was crawling now. There was no way that I could run. The walls and ceiling were lined with metal, kind you see on the roof of a farm. Large pieces of wood seemed to brace the sheets, holding this makeshift tunnel together. I couldn't risk sliding against that, possibly cutting myself on the metal or hitting the wood and causing a cave-in, so I crawled. I pulled myself for what felt like miles, running into walls every now and then because the path seemed to curve like a snake. I had no idea where I was in relation to the hole that I had fallen through, but I told myself that there was an exit at the end of this. Had I not been crawling, I would have surely hurt myself far worse. There were parts of the tunnel in which the ceiling dipped down to maybe 3 feet above the ground. It hadn't caved in because the ceiling still lined it. Someone had built it like this. This again, in hindsight, I didn't care at the time. I kept telling myself there was nothing behind me. But I swore I heard feet scraping only inches behind my own. My jeans would brush against my legs every now and then, making it feel like someone was touching me, and even now I still can't completely convince myself that someone wasn't. I crawled and crawled until I reached an upslope. With joy, I looked ahead of me. There was a cellar door. The door was made of wood. I knew this because I could see light through them. I couldn't be sure, but I thought it might be the light from the car's headlights because besides all of that, I was just so immensely happy to find an exit. I crawled all the way to the door. I threw my shoulder into it. It budged, but it didn't open. I began to scream, my throat seared with pain. The most I could manage was a harsh crying noise. It sounded like a dying animal. I collapsed in exhaustion and pain, my eyes staring up at the slits of light before me. I was so close to being out of here. I could taste it. It was in that moment of silent defeat that I heard noise that was without question something moving in the tunnel. It sounded like something was being dragged along the floor. It would move, pause for a second, move again. I had nothing left in my stomach to throw up. I began to gag. I gathered myself slightly, trying to steady my hand enough to focus on the flashlight in the tunnel. What I saw, I still cannot rationalize. I know what I saw, but I can't convince myself it was actually there. I can't stop telling myself it was just a hallucination. I saw a child in a dirty sleeping gown. The gown was stained with something dark, brown, occasionally splashes of deep red. The child was extremely frail, like the pictures that people might see of a Holocaust victim. I could only make out one eye, bright, reflecting the light of the flashlight in between huge tufts of long, dirty hair. It reached down beyond the fingertips of the child, which were caked with dirt. The boy, the girl, or I'm not even entirely sure which, moved towards me with difficulty. He wasn't breathing hard, but it seemed that every movement of every muscle took every ounce of strength the child had. The thing that froze me, though, was the eye. The eye that was only visible because it reflected my flashlight. But even in that glint, I could feel anger, deep hatred, something like it. This is the point in which the English language really lacks the right words to explain the situation. I could tell that this child meant me harm, whether it was a hallucination or not. The thing was getting closer. I started to cry. It was getting closer and closer when I heard a voice from behind me. Jack, whispered the voice. It was Steve, I was certain. I tried to talk back, fully intending to say, open this up and get me out right now. However, given my current state, I'm sure it sounded just like a garbled nonsense. I clawed at the door, pushing against it with everything that I had, and finally, breaking eye contact with the child. As I did this, the flashlight rolled down the slope, coming to rest somewhere near the child's feet. What do you see? The voice asked. What are you talking about? I closed my eyes. I remember hearing a reply along the lines of, just look at it. Tell me what you see. And my own screams of frustration drowned that out. I was mumbling like a maniac when the voice told me calmly, rest for a second, I'll get it. The statement took me a second to settle in, at which point I closed my eyes tight. Steve, just do it, please, just open it, please, I whimpered. Just get me out of here. My voice was beginning to get louder. Steve, goddammit, open the fucking wooden door! I opened my eyes for a split second to see nothing. Nothing but black hair dangling in front of my face, a smile, glint out of light, hidden in the mess of tangles. I slammed my eyes shut. I screamed with every ounce of energy I had, open the fucking door! The door behind me gave way, and I fell onto the dirt, taking in a breath of fresh air. My eyes were still closed, but the first thing I did was scramble to find the cellar door and close it. And once I had done that, I took a deep breath and opened my eyes, and I saw the barn in front of me, illuminated by the headlights of the car. My head was pulsing with pain. I was covered in dirt and liquids that I didn't even care to know the origin of. My knees were at the very least dislocated, but despite all of that, I was out of the tunnel. I took a deep breath, I buried my head in my hands, and I said, Steve, why didn't you just fucking open the door? I waited for a response, but none came. Steve, seriously, it began. I was fucking clawing, I was screaming for my life, I said. I looked behind me. My stomach must have been on the verge of falling out at me at this point because it shifted again. The only thing behind me was the large mass of bushes that I had seen while examining the perimeter of the building. I was angry. Steve, this isn't the fucking time! Come out of the fucking bushes! I was getting ready to stand up when I heard a yell from in front of the building. A flashlight bobbed up and down in the semi-darkness. Steve was running into the open door of the structure, yelling my name and telling me not to worry. I must have lost consciousness at that point, because when I stood up, Steve was standing over me, desperately trying to wake me up. His words were almost incoherent, at least to my ears. He helped me to my feet, began to walk me to the car, and as we walked, I saw my flashlight sitting just outside of the cellar door. The light was fading. Steve brought me back to the car and drove me to the nearest hospital. I fell asleep, but he told me that he drove around for an hour before he found a main road. I don't think I ever told him the whole story. I believe he thinks that I was just injured from the fall. He never really asked me about it. We didn't bother to stay in contact much longer. It's not like we deliberately parted ways. We just sort of stopped hanging out after that trip and we went our separate ways. I've never been able to fully understand what happened that night. So many things I can explain away as being hallucinations. There's still so many things that don't make sense. The shower heads were there. They were leaking something. The door was real. The tunnel was real. Most everything else can be semi-rationalized if I can convince myself that I had a very bad concussion. A very, very bad concussion. But the one thing I couldn't have imagined was that cellar door was locked. It was locked. And then suddenly it wasn't. I'm still as skeptical as I've ever been, but I believe in what happened to me at the showers. I'm not a hermit or a social retard because of it. I drink a lot, but I'm still functional. I'll never return to Nebraska. No one will ever be able to convince me otherwise. I don't watch horror movies. There's absolutely nothing entertaining about being so desperately scared. That's it. Really, there's no typical ending of my story. I was changed by my experience, yeah, but there was no way to change anything about it or to fight back against it. I can't even convince myself that it wasn't just me seeing things. Believe me, I've been trying for years. Prior to this, there was no way to find any information on the showers. The legend didn't extend outside of the classroom of Mr. Mays. No one told stories like this to keep children away from a certain place or to scare them. It just wasn't known. I guess that's really the point of the whole story. I want people to know firsthand what this place is like. Maybe it's a drunk's rationale, or the kid inside me wanting to spread these kinds of stories again. I don't know. I don't care, but it's out there now. For people to mold and warp to their needs. Most importantly, it's out of my head. It's getting late. I'm getting another drink. Cheers. My name is Jack. And some of you may have read or heard a story about me, by me, a few years back. I'm writing this from the same shitty laptop that I used to drunkenly post the showers on Reddit a little over 5 years ago. It spent the better part of 2 years at the bottom of a box in my bedroom closet. I haven't had much use for it recently, and honestly, it isn't in the best of shape. The damn thing takes about 20 minutes to start up properly and dies the instant it's unplugged from its charger. Some of the keys are missing, some of them stick. I spent a good amount of time clumsily cleaning sugary soft drinks cut with whiskey out of every nook and cranny, but a thing can only take so much abuse before it just goes. Night, I got lucky. She managed to boot just for me. I think she has one more decent story left in her. For better or for worse. I don't really remember writing or posting either part of the showers. I do, however, remember feeling simultaneously listless and restless around that time period. I was tremendously unproductive, not working in my chosen field, and I had too much free time to spend thinking about those facts. I had told the story to some friends at the bar one night and shaken some memories loose, which led to that post. I woke up one evening and hopped on my laptop to find that the story thread was left open. I had typed it directly into the submission box, not leaving myself anything to edit. I just forced it out of me over a couple of long, drunken nights and threw it up on the internet for everyone to see. I tried to read it, but even outside of the memories that I would have rather avoided, each spelling and grammatical error made me want to shoot whiskey or chug bleach. I went with the former, and as far as I could remember, never made it through the whole story as it was written. It seems pointless to go back and read it even now. I've lived through this all enough times in my head. I don't need to do it to myself. I did read the comments, though. I may have hated myself, but seeing a bit of interest in my work gave my ego a boost, if only for a moment. I went back every now and then to check on them, but for the most part, I was forced to continue with my stagnant life while the story spread quietly around the web. I worked as a bartender. At the time, I split my free hours between sleeping and drinking. These occasionally overlapped or synced up with work. It was a vicious little loop that I had carved for myself. I wasn't a writer, like I had hoped to be at that point in my life, so getting to play the part on the internet for a few minutes, even now, every now and then, helped to break up the monotony of reality. Over the course of the next several months, I received several emails and friend requests from other old classmates or strangers who had taken an interest in my story. My former classmates' messages generally consisted of their memories of Mr. Mays and his story, asking nothing in return. I had guessed that most of them were either married or lost and needed a dose of nostalgia as a pick-me-up. Who could blame them? Though some of them actually wanted to meet up and grab drinks and really get into the past. I lived half a continent away from the town where I had attended Mr. Mays' class at this point, but that didn't stop me from making empty offers of company to several different people, if our paths ever were to actually cross. Now, I did wind up grabbing a beer with one guy who was just passing through on a summer night in Denver, but it wasn't what I was expecting. I'm 99% sure that he had never met Mr. Mays or myself. He dodged specifics when I asked him questions and repeated a lot of my statements back to me in agreement. I remember him nodding his head a lot and saying, "Yeah, that's right," over and over again. He was picking up the tab, so I didn't notice a lot of this until the next afternoon. It was also the last time I met up with anyone from the internet. I also got a surprising number of requests for the specific coordinates of the showers from a wide variety of personalities. There were people offering money, transport, even what was essentially malicious support if I would take them there, like it was some sort of guided tour. I turned them down, but would be lying if I didn't consider accepting some cash in exchange for the coordinates of a random barn that I could pull up on Google Maps. I didn't, though. As foreign and as surreal as the whole thing was, I did take pretty immediate notice of the power it gave me over people. It felt like I was back around a campfire with a group of friends hanging out and them listening to my every word with a much larger audience. It all started innocently enough. I'd be out with a friend looking for some decent conversation or a better lay, and my friend would bring up the showers and ask me to tell the story, and I would fight him on it for a bit before caving, ordering another round, launching into some variation of the bit. It did work like a charm. It seemed like every time I went out, I ended up with a new friend or a new notch on my belt. I hardly had to try. I was just drunkenly wandering down memory lane, and after a while, I had narrowed my sights, only bringing out the story for certain people for very specific ends. I used it to get laid. It's as simple as that. I would talk to a girl for a little while, get to know her just enough, take a guess at some of her fears, and work them into the climax of the story. I faced down ghosts, encountered demons, even had spiders rain down on me from the shower heads, but I made it out intact every time. If ever so slightly worse for wear. I was just damaged enough from the experience that a pretty girl might feel some sympathy for me, which I would thank her for while reaching out for her hand or maybe grabbing her leg. All roads lead to the same place. Hers. I would stumble back into my barren apartment every afternoon, throw on some different clothes, head back out to the bar. Whether it was for work or play didn't really matter. Like I said, all roads, right? I don't know how long I spent in this piece of shit phase, but I do know that Karen broke me out of it. Initially, she was just the next in a long line of women that I had yet to woo. We met at a bar, where I told her a story which led her to my place, but instead of her passing out after sex, we stayed up and we talked. It didn't feel like needless bullshit either. I felt like she understood me. And I her. In reality, I think we both just liked getting really messed up and swapping stories about our shitty childhoods and mental ailments with someone else so that we wouldn't have to make excuses for being alone. We actually did have the mental stuff in common, though. 2 different kinds of bipolar disorder. We thought that in some strange way it meant that we were perfect for each other. I don't need to be told how stupid that sounds. Karen also had a degree in political science from Rutgers, a wicked right hook, and one of the most persuasive and charismatic personalities that I have ever encountered. I worry that sort of thing isn't going to come across here because of what this is all ultimately leading to. I just don't want to do her a disservice. We didn't end up together for a year and a half because we were awful for each other. At that point in my life, I was both lost and an asshole, and I had turned her into a concept or an archetype in my head. She was the Nancy to my Sid, the Bonnie to my Clyde, and we were probably headed down the same path as both couples. I guess looking back, I had fit her into that awful, manic, pixie dream girl trope in my head. I was a lost guy looking for a girl with hair the color of a mood ring to solve the complex problems that was me. And any given day, she was the love of my life and my partner in crime. And the next day, she was my antagonist, an obstacle to overcome. It was all part of this story that I had seen play out in the movies and books so many times before, but in the end, it was me trying to fit a square peg in a non-existent hole. She made me feel good about myself, though, and I'm pretty sure I loved her. It's just that I was simultaneously loving and using her without realizing it. This wasn't to say that she didn't get use out of me. She started coming over to my place after we had spent a couple of nights together, and she never really left. Items of her clothing and her toiletries started showing up around the apartment, and I just kind of went with it. There was one night where I brought up how we had never actually talked about living together before it had already happened, and that night somehow ended with both of us blacking out in tears. But by the time happy hour rolled around the next evening, we were as good as new. It wasn't an issue at the time. We just sort of fell in together. Though I know this probably sounds unhealthy, and I mean, it was. We got off track. Karen took a great interest in my stories. The showers, particularly, interest her because she had come across a reading of it on a podcast or a YouTube channel and knew about it before she had ever met me. She thought I was messing with her at a bar, trying to take credit for a story someone else had lived, but I was able to convince her, and she didn't let it go after that. After long nights, we would lay in bed together, and she would ask me to tell her the story again, like some sort of morbid bedtime story, and each time I told it to her, I would embellish a little more, shake loose a new memory, pulled from deep within my imagination. I don't know if she actually believed it, or if she just wanted to, but it became our thing. But of course, the story eventually wasn't enough. She wanted to live it. Can we go there? Let's go to the showers. She wanted us to go together and face them down like some sort of boss fight. She consistently told me that it would be good for me to go back there and get perspective. She was convinced it would help me pick up writing again. Karen always told me that I had such good ideas, but that something held me back from letting them loose. She genuinely wanted to help, but I couldn't see how this would do that. Now, it seemed obvious. I think another aspect of her interest in the showers was just honest fixation. We both had a tendency to key in on a particular subject and dig deep into it until there was nothing of interest left to uncover. This meant that her attention genuinely burned intensely before quickly fizzling out. My refusal to indulge her one last wish and take her there, well, that just kept her going. She would strategically pick out moments where I was just drunk enough to loosen my lips, but not so drunk that I was off in my own world to ask about the place. Occasionally, she would bring up a piece of information that I had told her about the showers while blacked out that would resonate with me enough to put my arm hair on edge. Even if I couldn't conjure the memory while sober, my body recognized it. I knew she was getting closer to a something in me that I didn't want to address, but I never stopped her outright. I don't know if I even believed my own story anymore. I just felt a bit sick when I thought about it. She persisted, using every method in the book to try to convince me to take her there. Every new detail, real or otherwise, would motivate her to push me harder on the subject. It was the middle of winter when I caved. We were living in Fort Collins, Colorado. At this time, which was only a short drive from Broken Bow, Nebraska, I had still maintained my ground when it came to making a trip there, claiming that I didn't remember that we didn't have the time, that I had forgotten exactly how to get to the farmhouse, which are both partially true. But like I said, she knew when she could get the best of me. We were sitting on the couch, following a long night of bar hopping and friend drama. Luckily, we had found ourselves on the same side of this particular situation, which meant that night was going to close quietly. We were snuggled together under a blanket and watching the Coen brothers, that 2013 flick Inside Llewyn Davis. Karen was watching while I split my time between nodding off and attempting to read a screenplay that a friend of mine had sent to me. I had seen the film a half dozen times at this point. In it, a struggling folk singer loses his way after his partner commits suicide. Well, spoilers. Karen and I shared a mutual fascination with the subject of suicide, so it was only a matter of time before one of us said something. "I would hate to jump off a bridge, I think," she said. "There's a chance you live when you're hitting the water and you'll wind up, paralyzed or something? I guess I'd feel like an even bigger waste of space if I couldn't kill myself properly." I wasn't sure if she was actually wanting to get into it or not, but I bet. "I couldn't jump," I said, pulling her closely and closing my eyes. "That's way too much buildup and pressure. Too much time to regret it when you're falling, you know?" It wasn't a taboo subject with us. It was difficult to explain to those unfamiliar with us lifelong suicidal ideation, but discussing it in blunt and honest terms is comforting. When faced with it every single day, familiarizing oneself with something typically viewed as morbid, we shined a light on it. Know your enemy and whatnot. Even if it was concrete or lava below me, I couldn't do it. I don't want anything flashy, honestly. Give me a benzo and a couple of pints of tequila. I'll go gentle. Maybe I would jump, Karen thought out loud. But I would do it from, a plane. I just want that one last rush of adrenaline. You could stay alive and get a lot more of that, I replied. Not with those kinds of stakes. She had a point. I just want to be quiet. Let me drink myself to death with a book or some relaxing music to play me out, you know? Probably some Bright Eyes. Karen was quiet for a while. The character in the film overdosed in a bathroom stall and she spoke up. I just don't want to go like that. At the very least, I'd want to be around friends or even family if no one else is available. I was nodding off. Kind of like your teacher. I stirred. She hadn't brought up the story in a while, and when she did, she never led into it with Mr. Mace. I guess, I said. If I fell asleep, she'd be forced to leave it for the night. Let's go, bub, she said. Go where? No. I knew. Liquor store's closed, I grumbled. Nebraska! It's late. Next week. I'll take off work. I'll get someone to drive us. Why would anyone want to drive us to Nebraska? Brian seems interested. In Nebraska? In your story. You could write about it. It's been a while since you've written. I could bring my camera. From the way you describe it, I'm sure that I could get some good pictures. I was getting uncomfortable. But I was offset by my exhaustion. I don't want to go. I didn't put up much of a fight. Please? Please, for me. We never go anywhere. And the apartment gets stuffy, and it's my birthday next month. Okay, all right, I said, trying to appease her so that I could drift off. What about the cat? The next thing I knew, we were packed up and leaving the comforts of home for Nebraska. I'd said yes to the trip, then fallen asleep. And by the time I woke up the following afternoon, Karen had already secured one of our friends as our chauffeur and was requesting time off of work. It fit with my schedule. She was so happy, and I was on quite a bit of Xanax, but I wanted to keep the good times rolling. With our schedules and switching moods, happy was something that was hard to come by, so I thought about that as we packed up my car. I was asleep before we made it out of town. I woke up in another dimension. The view out of my window was an icy tundra that hurt my eyes. I hadn't seen that much sun in months, and the ice amplified it. Our friend Brian was behind the wheel of my shitty 2005 Ford Escape as we flew down the interstate towards Broken Bow. Everyone called him the responsible one in our group of friends, because he wouldn't get behind the wheel after drinking any booze at all. What only Karen and I knew was that he would be high as a kite while driving us all home and telling us how he was the only one of us not destined for a DUI. But he hadn't been in an accident yet, so we didn't say a word. Karen sat shotgun with a Sonic cup in her lap. If I knew her, which I did, she had poured out 3/4 of her drink and filled the rest of the cup with vodka. She noticed after a minute that I had woken up. Hey, bub, sleep well? She asked, turning around in her seat to face me. A vapor of vodka and a hint of cherry limeade flooded my nostrils and burned my eyes. Karen refused to travel long distances without what she affectionately called a roadie. She had adopted the term from her late father, who killed himself when she was 14. He opened his wrists over the sink in the bathroom while Karen was doing homework in her upstairs bedroom. And then Karen's mom was doing an intern in her office at work. Her preoccupation with suicide at least came from somewhere logical. She had always idolized Randy, her dad, and hadn't spoken to her mother in a decade. She told me this story often, frequently reinforcing the idea that any of her idiosyncrasies, bad habits that related to Randy were exempt from criticism. I made my only sensible move in this situation. Extra cup is for you, my dear. Half and half. She winked and handed me the styrofoam cup of cure-all. I needed it. My jaw throbbed. I've always had a problem with grinding my teeth in my sleep. It was so bad growing up that my canines actually grew outward like vampire teeth. It hadn't been an issue in some time. I figured that the previous night of partying alongside the anxiety about the road trip had just taken a toll. I took a sip of the drink and winced. About 1/4 limeade, 3/4 cheap vodka. Burn it, I groaned. I guess it fits the scenery, Karen laughed. Nothing except the frost-covered remains of last season's harvest and frozen dirt surrounded us for miles. I stared out over the miles of repetitious backdrops for a couple of hours. Barren earth occasionally gave way to tufts of shown trees that reached futilely towards the gray heavens above, seemingly ignored. They now resembled petrified roots that had aggressively snuffed out any hint of life that had once inhabited the numbers. Every now and then I was able to spot the rusted remnants of a vehicle or a crumbling shed hidden amongst the branches, surely soon to be overtaken by the vindictive woodland. The three of us passed the time by fiddling with a barely functioning tape-to-auxiliary cord converter that we had been able to play music off of our phones with. But unfortunately, even when we had gotten it to work, it was still a crapshoot, thanks to a spotty G4 connection on the planes. Karen and I chain-smoked Camel menthol cigarettes, much to Brian's dismay. He smoked too, but would only touch the baby blue packs of American spirits, which were all natural and burned for an eternity. Smoking anything else, he believed, was just asking for cancer. The drive was familiar. It had me wandering through foggy memories of my last trip to Broken Bow. I was frustrated, getting a bit uncomfortable because of the haze, so I had to drink about it. My own head was keeping me in the dark. Brian and Karen, despite having heard the story of the showers tens of times by this point, when they prodded me for new details once we had crossed the state line into Nebraska. I managed to dodge their inquisitions by telling them how it was a violation of tradition to listen to a band while on the way to the concert. This eased the pressure a bit, but my teeth were grinding and my jaw was aching, and this place was bringing something out in me, leaving me anxious and reflexively defensive. Brian had grown up in New Jersey, and despite the relative emptiness of that two-lane highway, he was driving like he was still there. I have no problem with sweeping across lanes without a signal, speeding, or rapidly jerking left and right to exit the interstate on any regular day. As uncomfortable as it might have been to avoid the eye contact of an angry truck driver that Brian had cut off, we always got to our destinations significantly faster than the GPS estimated. However, today, his highway practices were making me queasy. The honking of several angry passers-by got to be too much for me, and I threw in my headphones and pulled my beanie over my eyes in an attempt to give me sensory deprivation. I ended up drifting off after a bit. I had a dream that felt vaguely familiar, but I hadn't remembered my dreams in years, so I couldn't be sure. I was back at the bar, frequented during college, the same place where I had last met Mr. Mays a decade ago. The voices of the faceless patrons around the two of us were muted. I sat next to my deceased former teacher, who was sporting a sweater that read, "I'm the birthday boy." Mr. Mays looked up at me from a drink, eyes bloodshot from holding his booze and holding back tears. He didn't say anything, but I slowly recalled the conversation between the two of us from years ago, which rang through my head loud enough to fill the silence. I remembered his friend, the one they had lost. Mr. Mays looked away from me and into his drink. He didn't look back. I heard a noise like dripping water that echoed around the bar. Looking in front of me, I found a highball glass that was filled to the brim with what I had guessed to be whiskey. Without a second thought, I threw it back. It didn't sit well. I pursed my lips. I sat back on the table as the lights around the bar began to dim from the outside. And I rubbed my eyes and I breathed deep to quell the nausea, but it wasn't working. The room continued to dim as the dripping noise rang out around me once again, and I looked at the glass before me to find it filled again, the liquid still rippling from the recent pour. Another drop fell from above, breaking the surface tension and spilling the drink all over the bar top. I looked up to see a shower head hanging just beyond the light, dripping liquid. The sound of violently shaking pipes echoed around me, and the shower head began to shake. It began to erupt just as I was pulling back to reality with a jolt. I panicked and I thrashed about for a moment. My knee and arm cracked as I moved about, adjusting once again to the real world. "Oh, Bubs, easy now," said Karen with a chuckle. We had parked at a rest stop. Brian must have pulled in too quickly and hit the curb, which was what had woken me up. I tasted cherry limeade crawling up the back of my throat, and I felt my stomach rumble. We're outside of Hastings. Don't know how far. Use the restroom now or forever hold your peas, said Karen. I opened the door and the icy wind pushed it up against me, slamming my foot in the door. I pushed my back and rushed against the lot to the surprisingly bustling area. I did my business, washed my hands, attempted to ignore the leaking shower heads in the stalls at the back of the room, and I felt every drop in my chest. I hadn't had anxiety like this in ages. The nausea had come with me from the dream, and I gagged slightly at the sink. Closed my eyes and breathed deeply. I pulled a flask from my jacket pocket and looked around me to gauge the judgment that I was about to receive. The truckers around me didn't take a second look. But a father who was changing his infant at the station next to the door, he shot me a look. And maybe he didn't. I'm not sure why I cared. It wasn't going to stop me. One of the showers in the back turned on full blast. I took a pull from the flask, and unlike my dream, my stomach relaxed, and the gagging ceased. Cleared my throat of whatever had built up prior to the nip of whiskey, and I spit in the sink. It was a bright shade of red. I didn't panic. I just needed to eat at some point. I pushed back through the line of people that had gathered at the restroom door and jogged out back to the car. Karen was sitting inside with the window cracked, holding a dying cigarette halfway out the window. When she saw me, she flicked it out, rolled the window up, gestured for me to hurry up. I hopped inside and we were back on the interstate within seconds. And don't fall asleep on us again, bub. We're gonna need you to steer us from here, I think, Karen said. Just get us to Broken Bow, I said, staring out over some of the harvested fields that looked like they had been burnt. I'll guide us from there. I guess I did do tours. We continued down the interstate for a while Brian and Karen sung songs and I sat in the back seat working, trying to ground myself. We're gonna need some gas if we're gonna be hunting for this place out in the boonies, said Brian. He broke my concentration. Well, there's only about 10 gas stations around the entire state, so exit where you can, I said. I caught the tail end of a sign that read Broken Bow, but I didn't catch the other information. Within minutes, Brian was exiting the highway and pulling into what appeared to be a gas station. It had the pumps out front, in a small convenience store, but behind it was a rickety, single-story house. The design was Victorian, but it was faded and chipped, all to hell. Some of the windows appeared to be busted in, the holes stuffed with assorted cloths and rags. I felt a sense of recognition as I stepped out of the car and began to pump gas. Karen was running inside to grab snacks as Brian shouted after her. Hey, get me sunflower seeds, he yelled. She was already inside. Brian looked at me. Jack, sunflower seeds? Please and thanks, man. He closed the door behind him. Before I was able to tell him that I wasn't going inside, I grumbled as I walked into the old station. Brian was driving us, so I couldn't get too upset with him barking orders. I was just irritable and all over the place. The building had a familiar musty smell to it, much to my surprise, starting to help clear away some of the fog that had been bugging me. I was pretty sure that I had been to this particular gas station before. I figured that was pretty likely, considering where we were and the aforementioned lack of stops in the area. It was a neat coincidence. At least that's what I told myself. Karen was up at the counter, cheerily chatting with a young girl who couldn't have been much older than 18 about something or other. The girl was talking to Karen, but stared daggers at me the entire time. She wasn't even subtle about it. I figured I looked nervous and sweaty, so I didn't blame her for keeping an eye on me, but it still made me uncomfortable, and I found myself grinding my teeth. I was attempting to work the pain out of my jaw muscles with my knuckle while aimlessly wandering the aisles. Karen asked the young lady at the counter, point blank, "Do you know about the showers?" The woman didn't miss a beat. "People don't deal with anything relating to that sort of business around here anymore," she said. My legs locked up, and I turned my head towards her. She was staring directly at me, despite Karen being directly in front of her. That was all a long time ago. Her eyes remained locked on mine. I felt the pain in my jaw pulse, and my stomach lurch. This was not possible. Consciously and unconsciously, I was rejecting the overwhelming feeling of déjà vu. I raced for the small hallway in the back of the store. I held my stomach and refused to look up at the woman, but I could feel her gaze on me still as Karen pressed her unsuccessfully for more information. I managed to get through the door and locked it behind me before falling to my knees and onto the toilet that sat only a few feet in front of me. I could feel my stomach clenching tightly over and over again, but nothing was coming out. I was violently dry heaving and struggling to breathe. With the pressure behind my eyes and skull building, I forced a finger down my throat. I thought that if I could get whatever this was out of me, I would feel so much better. I was choking on my own finger and seeing stars, eyes on the verge of bursting before I gave up. I didn't need to pass out in the gas station bathroom. That sounded too close to rock bottom for comfort. I sat back, my body lightly glazed with sweat, and concentrated hard on a number of deep breaths in an effort to get my vision stabilized. It was the half-assed version of a grounding technique for anxiety that I had picked up at some point. I could feel the pressure release as I wiped away the torrent of tears that had wet my face. My eyes finally focused on a green picture frame next to the mirror above the sink. The picture frame read, "You can't choose 'em. You just gotta love 'em." And featured what appeared to be 3 generations of women laughing while posing outside of a large green farmhouse. The youngest of the 3 I recognized as the woman at the counter just outside. Next to her was what I guessed to be her mother. Next to the mother was someone familiar. It was a sweet old woman in a sundress. The same dress that she had been wearing when I had ventured into this shop with my friend Steve many years ago. The 3 of us had a nice conversation about the town and our post-college trip until our motives for staying in Broken Bow were made clear. When she found out that we were in search of the showers, her demeanor changed. She had given us a very stern, measured answer. People don't deal with anything relating to that sort of business anymore around here. That was all a long time ago. I got to my feet, my head spinning and splashing some water on my face. I had burst a capillary in my right eye. It was blood red and diluted, and raining tears. It looked like a mess, but I didn't care. After spitting up a bit of red into the sink, I walked out into the hallway, shooting one last glance at the picture just to make sure that I wasn't losing my mind. It was still the same old woman. I was definitely losing my mind. I quickly made my way towards the front door, knocking bags of sunflower seeds and sticks of jerky onto the floor. Karen was still talking with the girl at the counter. The girl was no longer looking at me. Was she ever? If I didn't know Karen, I would have assumed that she was hitting on the girl. That's just how she was. She had a way with people. "You feel okay?" Karen looked me up and down with a concentrated look on her face. The girl at the counter stared at her. "Did you get sick?" I looked at Karen, the girl, Karen again, now towards the car, and back at Karen. "Must have eaten something bad," I said. Glanced up at her. Bad stomach. Medications. She looked at me and calmly nodded, understanding. She seemed to sense that something else was going on, but I didn't care. "Thanks. Have a good day," I said. Bolted out the door. And the bell above me rang. I could feel it in my jaw. Karen followed after giving the girl some sort of excuse for my behavior. Hey! Karen caught up with me before I got to the car. "What's up with you?" I'm just tired," I said. She saw through it. I took a nip that went down the wrong pipe and got a little sick. It happens. Just wanted to avoid her judgy eyes. I gestured back towards the door. I mean, this is Jesus country. I feel like she would try to walk me through a pamphlet or something. Karen appeared to buy it and continued towards the car. I'm not looking to get saved anytime soon. "Who needs Jesus when you have me as your guardian angel?" Karen said with an exaggerated smile and a wink. I faked a gag. "You're gonna make me sick again," I said. She kissed me on the cheek. Hopped in the passenger seat of the car, and Brian had put on a Dandy Warhol album and was jamming by himself. "Let's bounce," said Karen, putting her sunglasses on and lighting a cigarette. I tried not to look back as we drove away from the gas station. We spent another hour and a half aimlessly driving around the outskirts of Broken Bow. I was giving directions to nowhere in particular, lost in thought about the girl from the gas station. It was entirely possible the whole thing was in my imagination, getting away from me. My mind was filling in gaps in my memory with the worst possible reality. Deep down, I knew it was the truth. I saw the little oasis on the horizon before Karen and Brian. My stomach went into a free fall and my vision became a tunnel. It must have steered us there without knowing it. And that had to be it. Maybe you had to get lost to find the place. Maybe it sought me out. Didn't really matter. I get quiet, feeling lightheaded. If I said nothing, we could just drive right by it and let it fade from our lives forever. Brian turned the wheel towards the trees without a word of guidance from me. This was the first point where I realized how desperately I didn't want to return to that place. I was sweating through layers of clothing and trying to keep my composure. Hey, maybe we just call it a night and try again some other time, I managed to say. Words fell out of my mouth, slurred and robotic sounding. That was the best I could do. I'm gonna try that ominous-looking patch of trees over there, but then I'm down for whatever you guys want to do, said Brian. I fixed in on the tree line as we slowly worked our way across the undisturbed field. I could feel the pull of a farmhouse, the tunnels, their weight dragging us toward them. The trees appeared to shimmer in the setting sunlight. The branches extended outward as if they were reaching for the car, beckoning us. Shit, bub. That is pretty awful looking, Karen said. Ring any bells? That's the place. The words went through my mind and out of my mouth in less than a second. I hardly even tried to stop them. Karen and Brian celebrated. I chewed at my fingernails. I told myself countless times that I would never step foot near Broken Bow, but here I was. I'd be lying if I said I never imagined it, though, running to the scene of my personal horror show to somehow get some answers or cast a light on what exactly the showers were. I spent a long time forming my own personal theories about the place, but eventually the effort seemed pointless. The truth behind them didn't matter in the end anyway. Part of them exists only within the confines of my story. But I posted on the internet and choose to show the world. To be anything to anyone with just the account. From a meeting place to a violent ritualistic cult to a site for experiments performed by the KKK or deeply rooted Nazis post-World War II. I'm not dense. I know that the real fear lies in the unknown. Horror was my bread and butter. I believe that was why the story connected with some people and left others disappointed. The showers in my story are filled mostly with whatever you bring to them. For me, the showers were more complex. They existed outside of rational thought and comprehension because my experience with them robbed me of those attributes in part. As we pushed through the brush, tree branches reached out and scraped against the car's exterior, forging new grooves and playing the metal like a warped record. The sharp grinding noises split my already aching head in two. I put in my earbuds to mute the noise. No music. I think Brian apologized about the car, while Karen looked at our surroundings like a kid who just stepped foot into an amusement park. That place meant something to me that I hadn't considered prior to that moment and still hadn't pieced together in its entirety. I just knew that as we begun to near the clearing, I felt that I had never had a choice in making this trip. I was always going to end up back here, one way or another. Every time I told my story, or Mr. Maze's story, I dug the hole a little deeper. Every drink I took to forget them, every girl I slept with to distract from them, and every fake fact I made up to distract myself from the real story just further solidified the fact that one day I would return. I was free to leave, go home, have all the booze and non-committal sex my body could handle. I could do these things because the showers are patient. They have time. All of my actions were simply futile attempts at prolonging the inevitable. I know how it sounds, but I'm looking back on it now and telling you the simple truth. I was always going to return to the showers because they were waiting for me. Brian stopped the car just short of the clearing in front of a tree that had fallen in the path before us. I could probably get us over this, but I've already scratched the shit out of your car, and this might do a number on our undercarriage, he said. We can walk, Karen said, putting on her coat. You guys can walk. I have some smoking to do, said Brian. We came all this way, and you're not going to even look around with us? Karen wasn't happy. Brian didn't seem to care. It's the journey, not the destination, Karen, he said. Besides, somebody has to keep the car warm. Neither of them moved for a few silent seconds. Brian grabbed his Ziploc-wrapped grinder from the center console without another word. Karen had been more upset with him about less before. He knew it would pass. Make good decisions, he laughed, setting up the music and turning on the headlights. Karen exited the car without another word. I gathered myself, and I followed. shooting an annoyed but understanding look at Brian as I went. Karen was already up the path in front of me. I was staving off a panic attack, but I ran forward to keep up. "So, what do you think?" I asked, trying to get her talking but not dwelling on Brian. She looked up and around, pulling a small bottle of vodka from her jacket. "We're not even on the ride yet," she grinned half-heartedly. She took a long pull from the bottle. The setting sun caught the plastic just right, and a ray of light momentarily blinded me. My head was still throbbing. She put the bottle down, and I was able to see the clearing behind her. There it was. Or rather, wasn't. The massive farmhouse that had once occupied the clearing was nowhere to be found. There was nothing there but the same untouched dirt that made up the fields around us. Karen took notice as we stepped out from the trees. "Seems a bit empty," she said, disappointed. "Are you sure this is the place?" I was sure. My brain was still trying to tackle the absent structure. Yeah, definitely," I stuttered. This is what happened to me last time." I walked the perimeter of the clearing, sipping from my flask. My eyes were drawn to the empty space where I was certain that a massive farmhouse had once stood. It shouldn't have been strange in hindsight. Old buildings get torn down all the time, but who had done it? When? Did this mean it wasn't abandoned when I had been there before? I couldn't wrap my mind around the situation. At the very least, there should have been some remnant of the farmhouse or evidence that the tunnels had been filled. There should have been a path in the trees carved out for the equipment they would have undoubtedly needed to clear the structure out, but everything looked undisturbed. It looked too clean. But this was the place. I was sure of that. I could feel it. The glow of the frosted ground was just a front. It was putting on a nice face to hide itself from me. I took another sip. There were no bugs, no rodents, no birds, no deer, and not as much as a spider across the tree line. It was winter, but surely there should have been something living in that space. There was no tracks or scat, just undisturbed land. It would have been picturesque. It wasn't so oppressively ominous. I felt like I was losing my mind. "So, where's the giant X?" asked Karen. "Not here, I guess," I responded with a fake sigh of disappointment. I wanted to get out of there before it could reveal itself. I felt like the pressure in the clearing was building, like I was standing in front of a giant jack-in-the-box. I don't know, it's been over a decade. "Come on! There has to be something here if the place was as big as you said. There has to be something left around," said Karen. "You would think. I'm not sure how big it actually was." Thinking back on it, I said, kind of like when you go back to your old elementary school after years and you could touch the ceiling. I was working my way towards the car at this point, directly across the clearing. Karen circled me broadly, running around and kicking at the ground with her eyes peeled wide. "The tunnels, though," she said. "The cellar door." "It's a big space," I shrugged my shoulders. "Trees could have overgrown it, or they could have been filled. They weren't the most stable things in the first place." Karen nodded where I was heading. "Where you going, bub?" "I'm gonna go get warm," I told her. "If it's gone, it's gone. It's probably for the best anyway." "Oh, come on! We've come all this way. We aren't leaving after 10 minutes, she pleaded. "It was a nice little road trip, but I'm tired and it's getting late, babe." I put my hands on my coat and continued towards the car, where Brian sat. He was ripping a bong in the back seat. "Well, that's some bullshit," he said from behind me. I turned around to face her. She was powering through the vodka that she had opened only minutes ago. With a flourish, she finished the bottle and whipped it over my head into the trees. I didn't hear it hit. The growing pain in my gut flared. It was surely just something to do with the stress, but you can't breathe your way through an ulcer. I fell down to a knee. The ice on the ground had thinned beneath me. It was just frost and hardened earth. My chest tightened. "I think we should go. I think I need to go to an urgent care." "Fucking convenient," she said. "You're not getting your way, and so suddenly you pull the trump card. Okay, Jack, I'll take you to an urgent care in the middle of Kansas." "Nebraska," I said. She shot me a look like a bullet. Her body language shifted dramatically. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said sarcastically, moving towards me. "It's just that your story changes so fucking often that I don't know what the truth is and what you're bullshitting." She picked up a rock and whipped it into the trees. It wasn't thrown at me, but it was close enough that I considered it. I didn't hear it land. My jaw popped. Let's go to urgent care, Jack. They can give you something and tell you it's a panic attack again. But then we're coming back here. She was flipping. When you're in a relationship with someone with rapid mood fluctuations, you learn the signs and how to respond calmly to make the whole situation easier for everyone involved. I knew her inside and out. You're a fucking dick, dude, I said. You also learn which buttons to push. The pain was getting to me. She stepped towards me with purpose. What the fuck did you just... There was a dull, hollow thump beneath her boot. She froze. I froze. We both looked down to find a large set of wooden cellar doors that had been hidden by dirt, debris, and ice. But at that moment, it seemed impossible that we had missed them. A malicious grin crawled across Karen's face as she looked up at me. Let's just go, Karen, I said. She cleared off the doors with her feet. Please, let's just go. What's down? She said, trailing off. We gotta go. Please. What's down there? No. What's down there? She repeated again, her gaze jumping between me and the door. What's down there? What's down there? Her voice was getting louder. Make something up, Hemingway! She was yelling. What do you call a writer that doesn't write, Jack? And my gut felt like it was bursting. I was frustrated and kind of drunk and stuck in a fog and thinking about the girl at the gas station and how Brian was being rude and Karen was trying to hurt me. She was just baiting me at that point. I bit hard. Fuck you. You made me do this. I never wanted to come back here. You made me come back, and now you're gonna chastise me because it doesn't live up to your expectations? I felt unexpected tears falling down my cheeks. It's just a fucking story, Karen. A horror story. Horror as in afraid, and a story as in you weren't fucking there, so you don't fucking know. You don't know what happened. I could have made it all up. I did. For you and every other girl I told it to. I felt angry. A ball of fear was growing inside of me. I wouldn't. You made me come here, and I would never make you go back to... I stopped myself. I felt guilty. I had drawn a line and crossed it within only half a slurred sentence. Karen's shoulders dropped and her gaze shifted to the dirt at her feet. She then walked forward, filling the gap between us, and in an instant, in one swift motion, she punched me in the face. I felt very little. Tell me what you're so afraid of, you lying cunt! She breathed through gritted teeth, staring a hole through my chest. I said nothing. It was my only course of action. Big bad hero in your stories, facing down anything that comes in your way. I'm standing right here, so tell me, what are you so afraid of that you'd blow us up to avoid it? I had nothing. I don't know, I uttered under my breath. I could feel myself beginning to wobble. It wasn't the booze. It felt like my body was confused, like my brain was playing catch-up and had left everything else on standby. It was the truth. I had no idea what was waiting for us in that tunnel. I couldn't muster a name or even a vague description because I couldn't remember. I'd spent so much time embellishing and lying about it to reach certain ends that I had never really processed what had happened to me there. I never thought about how it changed my perception of myself, let alone my perception of reality. I never had to think about it. I just turned it into a story, and I spread the story. I was doing the same thing Mr. Mays had done, just on a larger scale, lie. I distanced myself enough from the reality of the situation because it was easier to swallow, and most importantly, it was under control. But here I was now, being forced to face it again. I had no control. It's a dark, dirt fucking pit in the middle of fucking Nebraska, Jack, she taunted, taking a single step down into the darkness, swaying the whole time. I'm going in without you, fuck it. Please don't, I begged, screaming. I was lost in the depths of a panic attack at that point, but I couldn't figure out the exact reason why it was happening. It's like I knew the reality of what waited in the darkness, but wasn't able to articulate it clearly. What do you see, Jack? I remember the voice and the fear, but not the answer. Karen took a couple of steps down where darkness swallowed her up to her hips. Don't wait up, she smiled, mocking me, and disappeared into the cellar. She let the heavy door fall above her. It landed with a muted thud and a puff of dust. The clearing around me fell silent. I could hear bits of the frost-covered ground crackling quietly around me as my body heat escaped. I stood up and looked at my car's headlights, glowing bright in the distance. Ryan was likely passed out in the back seat by this point, wrapped in a sleeping bag. I couldn't bring him with me anyway. I don't think I was allowed. I stared at the cellar door. I could hear no sound coming from below. There was no pressing need to go down there at all. If I waited quietly right here, I had no doubt that Karen would emerge, no worse for wear. She would give me shit about being a coward. We would all sleep it off in the car, then drive off towards our regular life once more. Maybe this was close enough. I had come back to the showers once again despite my fears, and maybe now I could finally let it go. Karen had seen the birthplace of the story she obsessed over, and I had confronted whatever it was that I needed to confront there. Nothing more needed to be done. After all, the farmhouse was gone. The land had frozen over, and it seemed like the place had been completely abandoned. It would never take anyone again. It would never hurt anyone again. All I had to do was stay right there on the ground and wait. Within seconds, I was staring into the beckoning darkness of the cellar. The moonlight hardly seemed to pierce the black veil as I made one hesitant step downward, followed by another. The door was heavier than I remembered, but what did I know? My memory was terrible. I inched my way down the icy ramp. I watched my feet disappear beneath me, swallowed by the darkness. Took my legs next. I was helping it along. Even through thick pants and boots, the darkness felt a great deal colder than it should have. My legs felt like they had been submerged in ice water. I was up to my knees when I felt a familiar shooting pain in my right leg, one that I hadn't felt in years. I knew it was psychosomatic because it had to be, but it ran up my leg so quickly that I grabbed at it on reflex alone. I had shifted all of my weight onto my left leg, which had tried to root itself to a thin patch of ice. Of course it did. I tumbled downward into the abyss. The heavy cellar door fell behind me with a crash, and all traces of light from the outside had been snuffed out with that door. The fall seemed to last longer than it should have, but maybe I was just panicked and unable to properly gauge the passage of time. I landed hard on my shoulder, which took most of the impact. My head was second place. My shoulder hit, my neck whipped, and my head bounced hard on the ground. I think I lost consciousness, but it was difficult to tell. My waking environment was already silent, pitch black and freezing cold, so there was little difference between consciousness and unconsciousness at that point. I don't know how long I laid there, but I know I wanted to stay put as I felt the pain shooting across my skull. I rolled onto my back, groaning loudly but unable to hear it well. It sure as hell sounded like I was underwater. I reached my bare hand into my pocket and grabbed my phone. Now, in hindsight, I don't know what I was doing trying to walk down there without a light. I hadn't been thinking clearly. I removed my phone from my pocket and pressed the home button to find a web of broken glass covering a picture of Karen and I, my phone's wallpaper. It was a selfie that she had taken of the two of us in what could have been any one of the numerous local breweries we frequented. Her eyes were closed and she was smirking while kissing me on the cheek. I was half smiling. My hair a greasy mess. My eyes were tinted red. I wasn't subtle. I didn't remember that night. The screen flashed a message about a corrupt SD card, followed by one about low battery. I had done a number on it in the fall. I swiped my thumb across the screen to turn on the flashlight, and I could find tiny pieces of fractured glass grinding against my thumb. "Just get me through this and I'll buy you a new screen," I whispered to my inanimate companion. I had to fill the silence with something, and still my own voice sounded distant and muted. I opened my jaw wide to alleviate the pain in my head. It cracked 4 times in rapid succession like bubble wrap, but the pain persisted. The light from my phone flickered to life, illuminating my surroundings. It wasn't as bright as I would have expected. Either my phone light was dying or those tunnels were eating the light, keeping it from showing me more than it wanted me to see, but I could see enough. The little details came rushing back to me instantaneously. Gaps in my memory were filling so quickly that it made me dizzy. They really gaps, though? No, they had just been pushed to the side, overlooked. My leg began to throb like it had when I fell through the floor of the now demolished farmhouse so many years ago. I wondered if the hole was still there, holding on to a piece of denim that it stole from my jeans. I heard feet shuffling behind me, in front of me, all around me. Every step I took was slow and careful and deliberate, but still, there was a brief delay and another step directly following my own. I told myself that it was just the echo. That place had an echo, but it shouldn't have. The familiar, putrid stench burned my nostrils. It burned my eyes. It made my now surely decaying stomach clench in an attempt to force me to vomit. Much to my dismay, I just gagged violently. It lit up parts of my memory that I couldn't properly verbalize, like the smell of a home-cooked meal or your childhood home. But instead of feeling comfort, I felt anger. I hadn't thought about that awful stench in years, but I couldn't grasp how I could have possibly forgotten. It had always been right there. Why would I let it get away from me? And then I saw her. The child in the stained robe with the black hair. She was twitching in the distance, just on the border of my peripheral vision. Her skin was pale. Her hair ran like veins down to her knees. Her gown was just as tattered as the last time we met. She was gone with a blink. I turned away. I had seen her. She had been in my nightmares waiting for me. It was coming back to me. I just wake up and I move on to my day afterwards. How could I? I turned back. She was directly in front of me. I could feel her breath warm against my face. Her breath, it smelled like death. Or did it? Her hair hung over my face. Only her eyes were visible as it reflected the light of my... There was no light. No girl. It couldn't be. It was pitch black. I felt for a wall and my hand brushed against cold metal sheets. The kind that might be used as the roofing on a barn. It was rusted and brittle. I grounded myself. The smell remained. All of my lies, all half-truths, made-up details about this place, they were stripped away. There was no more hiding from it, no more deflecting the truth. I was back in the place I had sworn to never revisit, but was always heading back towards. And I had to laugh. It probably sounded like I was losing it. Years of sleeping on couches and subletting rooms, and I had never gotten comfortable with any of them. But somehow, in this godforsaken place, I found at the very least some familiarity. It's like a fucked up home because as much distance as I had put between us, it had stuck with me. It was part of me. That seemed about right. I was walking through a haunted house of my own making. In my delirium, I began to wonder if that place had really been around before me. Had I called it into existence? Was Mr. Mays just an old kook who had inadvertently put me on a path towards manifesting this place of filth and evil? Was this a prison that I had constructed for myself? The tomb that I was always meant to die in? I reeled myself back in. It's like the dark and silent void was calling out for me to fill it. So my mind was attempting to do just that by letting anything and everything fly forth. But it was too much space to fill. It would be way too easy to get lost there. That's how people lose their minds, isn't it? I told myself that I was going to get back on medication when I got out of there. I'm going to need some Xanax at the very least. My light went out. I heard the familiar cry of an animal in the distance. It was coming from right in front of me. No, it was a voice. It was an animal again. A dying doe. It was wailing. So loud it was in pain. I was in pain. The wailing was coming from within my head. The light flickered back to life for a moment. I took in the nothing that stood before me. I needed the light. When I lost it, I immediately began to lose myself. I was likely to spread out across the place in an instant, and the light was the only thing that kept me there, confined but safe. I was in the realm of the known. Anything outside of that was where the real horror waited. A flash of bright red appeared in my peripheral vision. Of course. How could I have forgotten that? I turned to face the red door. I wouldn't have looked out of place in a model home in white suburbia, yet here it was, out of its element, just like me. The door faded and my light died once again. It was for good this time. I calmly told myself over and over again that when deprived of sight or sound, the brain will hallucinate, populating the glaring gaps with whatever it can. None of this was real. I was in a hole in the ground in the middle of Nebraska, and I was not going to lose myself there. I was wandering blindly through the darkness. I heard Mr. Maze's voice. It was not the joyful and calming one from his classroom, but the dejected and drunken one from the bar. "That's a bad place, Jack." I could smell the liquor on his breath like he was sitting in front of me once again. Cops, drunk, taken by wildlife. I could hear him slurring his words. I punched the wall in front of me. I heard only a muffled thud where the brittle and rusted metal sidings that covered the interior of the tunnel fractured. It shaved the skin off my knuckles. I wish they'd have found the body, though. Then we could have shown them. I felt nothing but the warm blood running down my fingers. This place was taunting me, I'm sure. I'm pretty sure. I screamed out. I couldn't tell. I just needed a drink to rein my thoughts back into my own control. My memories were populating the seemingly infinite empty space around me, and the only thing I wanted was for them to quiet down so I could hear myself think. I fell to my knees, and this is what it wanted, this place, even though it couldn't want, no. I did this to myself. I wrote this ending for myself when I went chasing the infamous showers and posted about it on the internet. I built this extension of myself that was now eating me. It truly was just a hole in the ground in motherfucking Nebraska that I used to dump my own fears into. Nothing more. I was going to end up like Mr. Maze. Karen was right. The room began to quiet and I could feel it shrinking. It's fucking hell on earth, if you ask me. It was him again. But this time I was more acutely aware of the sadness, uncertainty, and fear in his voice. I closed my eyes. Not that it mattered much, I told myself the truth. Mr. Maze was just a tired old man. I couldn't tell if I was speaking out loud or not. He had a horrific experience in his younger years, and because of it, he lost a friend. The situation was as simple as that. Maybe they found his friend's body, and maybe they didn't. It didn't really matter. Mr. Maze just couldn't cope with emotional trauma so grandiose that he drank himself stupid to shrink it down into a manageable size, something small enough to hide away and check in on really bad nights every now and again. But it was always the driving force behind everything he did. I didn't realize what I was actually doing at the time, but if you just replace his name with mine, it might make some sense. I felt something creak from above me, and I felt a drop of something on my shoulder, but my attention was quickly stolen by something else. "Jack?" The voice cut through the silence with a knife, and I perked up. My heart was back to 100 beats per minute. My brain was on fire, so it took me a second to process what was happening. Karen is a person. Karen is my girlfriend. Karen went into the tunnel. I went after Karen. We were both in the tunnel now. Karen just spoke. Karen, come closer to me. Come out. "You were talking to yourself," she said. Her voice was soft and she sounded concerned. "You were talking to yourself like you were sleeping just now. Why wouldn't you bring me here?" This was the venue in which I finally had a real conversation with my girlfriend. A subground living nightmare in the pitch black as a disembodied voice. "I don't know," I replied. She was audibly upset. "After everything I've given up for you, you're still gonna feed me that bullshit? I mean it, I don't know," I told her. "I don't know what this place is or what happened to me here. I can't explain any of this. Can you? It was a beat. I was pleading with her, but didn't know what my goal was. I was just letting everything out. "So I don't know what this place is or what it did to me, except that I wasn't the same after it. I'm just fucked up, and I don't know why. I can't do anything about it, and would never want to put you through this, ever. I was afraid. I mean, look at this place." I gestured to all around me. Neither of us saw it. "I could have helped you." I noticed the past tense. I could hear her either moving towards me or resting against the wall. How? We could have shared it. I heard the tears in her voice. I didn't know what to say. Well, we are now. The walls were groaning around us. The noise concentrated above me. "What is that?" asked Karen. "It sounds like something's going to Ice-cold water rained down onto me from above. instantly soaking me from head to toe. I gasped hard, taking in a deep breath and some of the liquid along with it. While my every muscle tensed up from the shock and the cold, I could taste rust, maybe iron. Before I could think about it for too long, my body acted without me, coughing and sputtering to rid my lungs of the tainted water. I fell once again to my knees. I knew exactly what hung a couple of feet above my head, despite the complete lack of light, but I didn't care. I wanted nothing more than to be out of that place, but I didn't move from underneath the shower head. I looked up, and I let the freezing rain pour directly onto my face. I let it swallow me. If some cold water was all this place held for me, I really did have nothing much to fear. I heard a loud and deep rumble that seemed to emanate from within the walls around me, and Karen screamed. I heard water pour onto the ground from my left, then my right, then in front of me, then behind me. Still, I sat there with my hands pruned, feeling my breath turn into ice as it left my lungs. Despite the extremity of this situation, I began to feel a calm from within me and slowly spread my arms out at my sides. The showers rained down around me, a symphony of crystal clear noise from the creaking pipes to the dull spatter of each droplet of liquid as it hit the ground and fell over me. Every sound was clear and full now. The sound itself was so full that it almost illuminated the room, carving out every last nook. I took it all in. I accepted it. If this place wanted me, it could have me. I had made a pilgrimage to that place that birthed the subhuman thing that I had become over the last several years. If they wanted me back, I wasn't going to put up a fight. I could hear Karen screaming my name and telling me that we needed to get the fuck out of here. The showers grew louder, drowning her out. This was more important. My body began to numb and my skin began to sting with every drop of water that hit me. A sense of instability, strangely like vertigo, began to overtake me. I opened my eyes, still seeing only darkness but feeling something else. I was Mr. Mays. Back in his classroom, my classroom, recounting the story of this place to my students. I was in the tunnels, carrying my friend Steve, the man who first ventured to this place with me years ago, away from an approaching darkness beyond us. He was bleeding from a head wound. I was reaching upward in bed, sweating, soaking my sheets, and crying. I was in a bar telling me my Mr. Mays story, struggling to find the right words while I ordered another. A dull, wet thud rang out a few feet ahead to my left, snapping me back to my body. Karen had fallen and screamed my name, which now rang out loudly above the noise of the showers. "Jack, what's going on?" she screamed. As I heard what I could only assume to be her body drag across the muddy floor away from me, I could feel again. I was freezing cold. My injured hand could hardly move. I began to crawl forward as fast as I could towards the sound of her screams. They were going to find her body so that we could show them. No, I wasn't thinking straight. There wasn't going to be a body. We were going to get out of the darkness. No one was going to be lost here. I threw my body in the vague direction of her scream, reaching out as far as I could with my arm, despite being unable to feel much of it. Through some stroke of good fortune, my arm slapped against her shoulder. She immediately grabbed for me. I could close my hand as tightly as I could around part of her denim jacket, and I pulled her close and wrapped my legs around her. She wrapped her arms around me and buried her head in my chest. Her screams were only slightly muffled, and I let her have that. I didn't know what else to do. I just held her as tightly as I could and looked out into the darkness. I don't know what I was looking for. Her screams eventually turned into loud sobbing as the water pressure from the shower heads audibly died down, eventually stopping completely. We lay there together in the freezing mud for a few quiet minutes. Eventually, Karen's sobs quieted. We need to stand up, okay? He stuttered. Frozen. I loosened the vice grip I had on her and I stumbled to my feet. I didn't let myself lose contact with her for a moment. She rose to meet me and we as close together as possible. I certainly had no idea where we were in the relation to anything down there, and I'm sure she didn't either. We gotta find a wall. I locked my arms with hers and moved to my right, which was as good a place to start as any. After about 10 long shuffles, I bumped into a solid cement wall. I couldn't tell if it was covered in ice or if I was just so numb that I couldn't feel the coarse cement. It was likely a bit of both. Karen kept her head against my shoulder. I started to feel emotional, angry. She had forced me to come back to this place. The anger bled into sadness. She was going to have to carry this with her. I should have never let this happen. I should have stopped her or told her that I made it all up. I was muttering to myself under my breath. The rusty pipes creaked around us. With each noise, I felt my stomach heave. Despite the numbness, my jaw throbbed in pain. I wanted to give up. I was so tired and so afraid. I wasn't strong enough, and I knew it. I wasn't the person who was going to save his girlfriend and come out of this a hero. I didn't even think we were going to get out of this at all. I was lost in thought, putting most of my weight against the wall as I moved us along. I wasn't expecting a sharp corner. I felt my shoulder push into sudden empty space, and I managed to get one hand onto the corner of the wall as I fell, but that did nothing, and my feet gave way in the mud beneath me. I fell hard, my head bouncing off the ground with a thud. I was instantly sure I had broken some fingers on my right hand. The angles seemed completely wrong when I rubbed them against my cheek. I screamed, mostly out of frustration, which caused Karen, now alone somewhere in the darkness above me, to scream back. We were yelling at each other. After a time, we were too exhausted and out of breath to continue. I focused on my breathing, trying to bring myself back. I sat up, pushing my left hand through the icy mud to ease myself to my feet. I felt something on the ground. It was smooth, but not like cement, like metal. It was small. I gripped it in my hand as best as I could as I stood up. My legs weren't going to hold out for long. I was getting the spins, but I couldn't tell if it was from the booze, the possible concussion, or the disorienting darkness. Karen was quickly at my side. She grabbed my hands and pulled herself close to me. "I'm sorry. We shouldn't have come here. I didn't believe you," she cried in quick, successive breaths. I didn't care. I didn't want an apology. I wanted to scream at her and spoon her at the same time. I wanted to be fighting with her about something stupid in my apartment, the space above us filled with a mess of conflicting emotions. I felt us shrink. I was brought suddenly back when Karen broke the silence. "What do you have in your hand?" she asked. I had managed to hold on to the object. We both felt around it, desperately trying to get a sense of what it was. It could have been a piece of one of the shower heads, for all we knew, but for a second there was hope that it was our solution. It was kind of cylindrical. It was mostly metal. It had a little cap on it. I rolled it around in my hand, careful not to let it go. It had a button. I recognized it. It was a little flashlight, the kind hikers fasten to their backpacks. Flashlight, I stuttered. My fingers could feel the button, but couldn't quite press it hard enough. Let me push the switch. The light was hardly blinding. Both Karen and I prepared to shield our eyes, but were surprised by the weakness of the light. That outside of the main beam did little to help our situation. Once our eyes had adjusted slightly, we could see the shower heads surrounding us in a rundown and filthy room that seemed to have no exit. It looked and smelled like a pigsty. Mud and dirt covered the floor and walls. She wrapped her arms around me and I held her head against my chest. "Close your eyes. Just keep them closed," I told her. The loud wailing of a doe started on my left and quickly enveloped us like it was coming from surround sound speakers that we couldn't see. Karen covered her ears with her frozen hands. The tip of her fingers were bright red, maybe even purple. It was hard to tell from the weak light of the flashlight, but I kept the beam centered on us as much as I could. I didn't care that whatever was out there could see us. The light gave us some sort of warmth, or at the very least a sense of solidity. The noise began to die down until we were left once again in silence. "We have to move back to the tunnel. You have to help me find it," I said. Karen nodded, tearing her face away from my chest. Her tears had frozen her cheeks to my sweater. I could see a rim of ice around the red marks on her cheek. "Back that way, I think," she said, pointing to the left. The light didn't do much to penetrate the darkness, but I trusted her. So we began to shuffle through the mud, which was now the consistency of a slushy. It had seeped into my boots, but it didn't really matter. Every inch of me was covered in rusty water and frost, and a little more cold couldn't hurt. Every few steps, the flashlight would dim or flicker. You could feel Karen tense up every time I was forced to give it a shake, rolling the dice on how long it would continue to help us. At one point, it went out completely. She dug her fingers into my side. I shook it. Nothing happened. I hit it with the palm of my hand several times. Nothing happened. Please, I muttered under my breath as I hit the switch off and on several times in rapid succession. I couldn't let it go. It was all we had down in those tunnels, the only thing keeping us, or maybe just me, from losing myself to the darkness. And after a few more attempts, it was light. The light was across the room. An exposed bulb, maybe 40 feet across from us, came to life. It was dim, but it was enough to light up a significant portion of space in front of us. About 10 feet in front of the bulb and 30 feet from us stood the unmistakable silhouette of a buck, head bent down towards the ground. It had a large set of antlers, 12 points if I had to guess. Unable to grasp what I was seeing, I let the dead flashlight fall from my hands to the ground. The metal slapped against the cement, and the small bit of glass cracked like a stick snapping under a boot in the forest. The buck tensed up and quickly rose to attention, his antlers scraping hard against the low ceiling. Some of the points were grinding against it, while others cracked and broke off. The animal didn't seem to notice. At the very least, it didn't seem to care. As it turned its attention toward our general direction, Karen began to tug hard on my sweater. "We have to keep moving," she cried quietly. We continued down the path before us, while the stag began weakly bleeding. A jolt of pain shot through my temples. The noise went on continuously, one long whine that should have been interrupted by a breath at some point, but just kept going. There was an echo. I looked behind us as we shuffled through the dark, and I could see the glint of light reflecting off the eyes of the beast. It was looking at me. It was tracking me. I turned my head, and I heard several other bulbs come to life on the far side of the room, but I dared not look back. The door came into view in front of us. The paint was stripped, the wood was aged and cracked from years of weathering. Even still, I was able to get a sense of the brilliant red that used to cover the door. The knocker was missing a screw, and it hung limply off-center. The knob still had some shine to it, and I could see the reflection of the light behind us in it. As we moved closer, I went to reach my hand to grasp the knob, but Karen had already beaten me to it. She grabbed it and twisted. The internal metal mechanism shifted loudly, quieting the bleeding of the buck in the distance. The door cracked and creaked, even as Karen peeled her hand from the icy cold metal. The wood began to split. The cracks moved rapidly outward from the knob, crawling across the wood until they reached the hinges. The door shifted and began to tip outward. It was going to fall on us if I didn't have the strength to stop it. It began to tilt, and I raised my hand up, and I shielded Karen's head while trying to move us out of the way. Finally, the door caught on the old screws in the middle and lower hinges, and it swung around to the left right in front of us, and I felt the rush of cold air as it brushed within an inch of my face and slammed awkwardly into the wall. It fell onto the ground with a resounding crash. Through the doorway, I could make out familiar winding tunnels. The ceiling rose and sank like a roller coaster. This seemed to be a part of some twisted design. In some places, you can find more than 3 feet of clearance from top to bottom. But right now, there was none. The metal sheeting that held the earth at bay had given way. This couldn't be how we gotten in. It certainly wasn't how we were getting out. "Fuck!" I screamed, exhausted. My legs burned. My mind was still on fire. Every motion I made was out of instinct because I couldn't properly process what was happening around me. Neither of us turned around. We stood in front of the doorway, staring at the caved-in tunnel that seemed to seal our fate. Karen tried to cry, but had nothing left in her. Didn't blame her. I grabbed her hand and I held onto it tightly as more lights flickered to life behind us. Surely, if we turned around, we'd be able to at least see another exit, but the uncertainty of what else we might see stopped us. I heard the hard clapping of a set of hooves on the ground somewhere behind us, then another, and I saw shadows of what were unmistakably humans, growing smaller as they moved towards us. It was the children. I was sure of it. Even amidst the already overwhelming stench, I could smell them. Pennies and vinegar. Their robes dragged across the mud. Their hair covered them, having grown down past their knees, and Karen gripped my hand back, 2 shadows moved along the walls, then 5, 10, and I lost count. More bulbs came to life. The frost that had built up on the cement walls began to melt. Each new light source caused the shadows to fade more. They seemed to be antlers atop the heads of some of the children before they were drowned out completely by more light. The room was warming. One of them flickered just a couple of feet to my left. On my right, Karen's head turned upward. There, protruding several feet from the wall, was a shower head. It was old, rusty, caked with frost. It was fragile. With her free hand, she reached up, grabbed a hold of the pipe, and pulled downward, squeezing on my hand as if she was using me for leverage. It broke off with surprising ease, and Karen pulled back onto my shoulder as water sprayed into the room behind us. I could hear feet skittering through the mud and away from the jet of ice. Karen turned to face me, her eyes mostly closed, as she buried her face in my chest, and she offered me the shower head, the weapon. I took the rusted metal pipe in my hand, and for the first time in ages I felt like I had a little bit of control, a choice to make. The footsteps around us grew closer, picking up speed. I fucking hate this place, I said as I swung the pipe through the air to my left. It smashed through the bulb with ease. Shattered glass ran into the mud. As to my surprise, the other lights in the room began to extinguish. One by one, the room fell back into darkness, and I didn't know if it was better to die in the light or in the dark, but at least I got to break something this way. I heard the familiar bleating once again alongside the dying cry of the doe. The footsteps were very, very close now, only feet away, and I hugged Karen as tightly as I could when the light bulb went out. There we stood, in the darkness once more, surrounded only by screams of creatures that we couldn't see, and I finally turned my head to face the room, still holding on to Karen. The bulbs had died, but the filaments still had a slight glow to them. It looked like the glow that followed a camera flash. As my eyes adjusted, I could still make out the silhouettes of children. Some of them were no more than an arm's length away. There was a familiar anger in the air around them. They hated me as much as I feared them, and maybe it was for the same reason. I couldn't even guess what was going to happen once they got a hold of us, but I hoped that I would, at the very least, not be afraid anymore. The filaments in the bulbs cooled completely, and the darkness settled. I closed my eyes. "I'm sorry," I spoke into the top of Karen's head. The children were right on us. I could feel a warm breath on the back of my neck, and I snapped my eyes shut. Without warning, it ceased. The moisture on my neck began to cool. Feet flew through the mud away from us. They were fleeing. The bleating and crying of the animals stopped abruptly, and in seconds, the room had settled into a deathly silence. I slowly opened one eye, and I looked upwards. About 10 feet in front of us was a ray of bright light. It was powerful. It was cutting through the dark and shining straight onto Karen and I. It made the frost on her bright red hair twinkle. I had no idea what I was looking at and briefly considered that I was wrong about religion before I heard that familiar growl of a car engine. My eyes adjusted and I could see that the light was coming from a hole in the ceiling where the wooden boards had collapsed long ago. And I couldn't fucking believe it. I didn't say a word as a car door slammed and Brian's voice echoed down into the hole. "Hey, down there!" His voice rang out, filling the room. Karen looked up and broke away from me. There was a sense of relief in her eyes that her face didn't show. She moved quickly. "Brian!" Her voice croaked. "Brian! You get us out of this fucking hole right now. I'll buy you a whole goddamn grow house." "You promise?" He laughed. I assumed they could see each other now. Karen was looking up at the hole with a glare. She was bathed in light, and I stood there, slowly began to move toward her. My knee popped, my joints ached. I was dizzy and I was confused, but this felt real, tangible. "Okay, but it's not gonna be easy," yelled Brian. "This rope is kind of icy, but I don't really have another option. I'm still a little high, so I'm gonna have to make it work. But how the hell did you guys get down there?" Karen didn't answer, as Brian dropped down an old purple climber's rope. She grabbed it and began to ascend like her life depended on it. Brian was grunting from above and jokingly commenting on how she'd gained weight. She was up and out of the hole within seconds, and I was left alone in the room. I looked around me. The space was smaller than it seemed just minutes ago. The walls were cracked. The mud had mostly frozen solid. The showers were empty. "Hey, you coming, Jack?" asked Brian as I finally made it under the hole. I grabbed the rope tightly and looked behind me towards the decrepit red door that now lay on the ground. In the tunnel behind it, I could make out the shape of a person, standing just beyond the reach of the light. I turned my back to them. With some help from Brian, I pulled myself out of the hole and onto the frozen ground outside. I breathed the fresh air into my lungs. I was free of the stench of that place, but my stomach was still in knots. The moon was reflecting off the snow and ice, lighting up the clearing around us, and I could see Karen pacing near the car. She was staying in front of the headlights. She stopped and fixed her vision on the edge of the trees. It began to sink in that she's now going to have to live with the same terror that I lived with for the rest of my life. It was always going to be my fault. I was on the verge of tears when Brian helped me to my feet. I still hadn't decompressed. My jaw was clenched shut, and I was sure that I had chipped a tooth. Every part of me was numb. My clothes were frozen to my skin. Karen began to scream, "It's there! It's right there!" She yelled and pointed towards the trees as Brian dropped me and ran to her. I slumped down and I stared at the ground. There was nothing to be done, and if there was, I didn't know what it was. I was as much of a mess as she was. Her cries started to blend into the background as my mind wandered back to Mr. Mays. I wondered what he would have done in this situation. But I remembered that he had been in this same kind of scenario, and his solution was to drink himself stupid. It didn't seem like a bad idea for the time being. I just needed a sip. I reached into my jacket pocket, I pulled out the flask, opened it, and took a sniff, and to my surprise, it burned my nostrils like gasoline. It made me nauseous. I closed it, and I looked back at the hole in the ground. I tossed the flask down into the dark. I didn't hear it hit the bottom. Cheers. I stood up and I walked towards Karen, whose cries were now sporadic. She was jumping at her own shadow as a confused and stoned Brian tried to help her. "Man, what's going on?" "I'll make sure the car's ready to go," I told him as I passed by without making eye contact. Karen saw me and froze. I took her hands and I held them in my own. "Jack, how was it like that? How were they like that? Why was any of that?" She rambled, unsure of what she'd seen and what she wanted to ask. Eventually she broke down. "This doesn't make any fucking sense. I didn't know. I didn't know." She bawled. And I just held her there. It was all I could do. She hit me out of frustration a few times, but still, I just let her go. I didn't know how to help her, but I could listen and be her punching bag. I east drove to the car and sat her in the back seat, wrapping her in as many blankets as I could and buckling her in. And as I walked around to the other side of the car, I looked back at the hole in the ground one last time, and I heard voices. They're probably just in my head. Brian drove through the trees as quickly as he could. Several times he seemed to begin a question, but stopped himself. He told us how he'd been in the car when he saw a light coming out of the ground, but he thought was one of us waving him over. We didn't react. There was a weight hanging over Karen and I that he didn't want to disturb. Questions could wait. I don't even know if he ever got around to them. Karen wasn't asleep, but her eyes were closed tightly. I was buzzing as we drove away. It wasn't until we crossed the threshold of the tree line that I was able to loosen the vice grip that I held on the door handle. The electricity faded as the tops of the trees that surrounded the showers was taken over by stars. I felt my insides begin to relax. The dam that had been holding something inside me back finally burst. I asked Brian to pull over. He obliged almost immediately without a word. I stumbled out of the car and began throwing up on the side of the road. The only thing that poured out of me was a thick yellowish bile that hung in the back of my throat before slowly dripping down and out of my body. This was what I deserved. I gagged and felt my eyes bulge as I purged and clawed at my stomach. Sore from a continuous heaving, I clenched my fist and I hit the ground, causing the wounds in my knuckles to open. I only now had taken a look at my hand. My middle and ring finger were broken. It looked like someone had taken a bottle opener to my nail. My first knuckle. I shouldn't have left them that way. But I didn't get much reprieve before I had to bow again. This was the tail end of an exorcism. What felt like years' worth of stress, lies, and fear violently erupting from within me until my lips numbed and my stomach slowly relaxed and my ears loudly popped, immediately relieving some of the pressure on the inside of my skull. I felt like I was floating. I was crying, and I knew why. But I couldn't quite isolate the thought. Everything was foreign. Everything in my brain was misfiring. I was rebooting. I had made it out. I sat in the dirt long enough that the vomit turned to slush on the ground in front of me. Brian stayed in the car and looked in the other direction. I think I even felt Karen's hand on my back at one point, but when I finished, she was in the car, staring anywhere else but me. I collapsed into the vehicle, shaking and soaking wet. Brian started to drive off before I even shut the door. I saw Karen's lips tremble several times, but she didn't say a word, and I didn't know how she managed that. I felt like I needed to talk about everything. I caught her looking at me once on the drive back as we passed by the exit for Broken Bow. We forgave each other for everything that happened, though neither of us actually said it out loud. We didn't talk about the showers much at all. We had filled that place with what we had brought there, pain and truth about ourselves that we were using each other to hide from. The horror that we experienced in that place was a dose of, as she would put it so many times before, perspective. It woke us up. We both realized, painfully sobering up over the next 6-hour car ride back home, that the two of us looking straight out the windshield without seeing, we were better off apart. Similar to the way that she had moved into my place, we never really discussed her moving out. The things just started disappearing. We repeated the old mantra about staying friends for the next week or so. We could practically hear it echo every time. With a soft kiss on my cheek on a Thursday afternoon, she was gone. Karen and I couldn't work because we fit too well together. We were two uniquely fucked up individuals with a penchant for flipping on a dime. It's easy to look back and long for those nights cuddling, watching movies together on the couch. It's a lot harder to remember reality. The night that we watched Llewyn Davis, and she convinced me to return to the showers, for example, was not as serene as I implied. I remember that I had gotten extremely irritated that she had picked out that movie because we watched it the month before. I felt a deep resentment toward her that almost pushed me to apathy. All this because of a fucking movie. Before that, Karen had called me a stupid fuckhead because I hadn't cleaned the cat's litter box. That was every night. A perfect couple and a perpetual potential domestic dispute rolled into one. Our solution was to rinse it all down and repeat. We were our own perfect enablers, and we were always heading towards the ending that we got. Broken Bow did nothing but illuminate what was already in front of us. I really hope she's doing better now. As for me, I couldn't continue to live how I lived after Nebraska. I was so covered in dirt and blood that I was able to have one of those hard look at yourselves in the mirror moments in front of an actual mirror and realize how far I had let myself spiral down. I wasn't just drunk or high, but I was both of those things because I was broken and needed something to fill the cracks. I couldn't use that place as an excuse anymore. I couldn't keep trying to change the story if that sounds like it came from the mouth of a quack therapist, because it did. I started going to therapy once every week, initially for the drinking, but eventually for everything else. I'm not a religious convert or a friend of Bill, but I respect the journey and anyone willing to take it, no matter the method needed to make it through. I wish Mr. Mays found a way to fight his demons before he left. I guess there are demons, really. I'll keep them for us both. I'm always going to carry the showers with me. They're part of who I am, but I don't have to let them kill me anymore. The most important concept that I've learned in these therapy sessions is that you can't get better if you keep covering up symptoms while ignoring the real source of your unhappiness. Blowing your brain out every night with substances just puts off the inevitable confrontation. You have to treat it like a wart. You have to cut it all the way down to the root and tear it out, get rid of it, to kill it. You have to get every last piece. That's why I came back here. This account, this story, so many others, out there who listened to Mr. Maze's campfire story throughout the years and then moved on like normal people. I fixated and spread it because I just couldn't resist. I can't unwrite my original stories. So my next play is to obfuscate. I fully understand that writing this defeats that purpose. Hopefully that won't matter, because there is a point to this. The story is yours now. I don't want it. I don't want it anymore. Take the showers, mold them to your needs, tell the story around a campfire, embellish what you'd like, put yourself in the story, or a friend of a friend, and then use it to get laid. Take your wildest theories about the place and create a story all your own. Make a movie or a book of it. Turn it into a local urban legend in your own town. Drown my story with uncertainty. In fact, go there. Go find them. Ask every citizen in Broken Bow, Nebraska about them until they run you out of town. Get lost on a dirt road a few miles east of the city until you stumble upon a place resembling the one that I've described, and then tear it apart. Bring your friends, take pictures, explore the tunnels, light a bonfire, get drunk, and throw a party, and then post about it on the internet. Cover the walls in graffiti and the floors with cigarette butts, broken bottles, and condom wrappers. Tell everyone you know about it and smother it. Flood the internet with so much speculation and rampant bullshit about this place that no one will ever point back to Mr. Maze or to me as a source. Drown us in the noise and let us fade away in peace. Go there yourself and burn it all. Just don't forget to tell everyone you know about how you did it afterwards. Shit. Okay, I'm sorry I let this go on for so long. This wasn't my intention. Old habits and whatnot, and I've been pulling from a dusty flask of whiskey that was next to the laptop in the box, I guess. Counts as aged now. I'm not really on any wagon, and after the years of bullshit I put my body through, a few more nips aren't going to hurt a thing. It's just one more for the road. I'm gonna log out of this. I'm gonna post this, log out of my account, tear up the old sticky note I saved my password written on, shut down this laptop for what I hope to be the last time, and bury it back under all the junk in my closet alongside this flask. Tomorrow, I'm going to go into my classroom in the community college where I teach a creative writing course, and I'm going to tell my students one of the many versions of the showers that I have told over the years. And no, it's not Halloween. And maybe I'll dim the lights, light a candle or two for atmosphere. Mr. Maze would be proud. The story I tell them is not going to be my story anymore. No, I'm telling them the story of what happened to my best friend. My best friend's brother's ex-girlfriend in some ritual part of Pennsylvania a few years back. I swear it's the truth. I can't take back what I did when I posted the story for the world to see. It's my next best move. Take a page from my younger self, spread the story like I'm playing a massive game of telephone that I intentionally went to disrupt and distort. If I wasn't at the heart of it, this could even be fun. Maybe it still will be. I gave you a story in some dark night 5 years ago, and the only thing I'm asking in return is for you to take it from me. Make it into something scarier, more violent, more cerebral, more personal. Give it a twist ending. My hope is that one day someone will tell me a version of my story, having claimed it as their own, with new facts and faces, and I won't even recognize it until I hear the name that now haunts others instead of myself. The showers. Hey there, everyone who's listening on YouTube, or those of you who are listening on the podcast. It's me, MrCreepyPasta, and before you head out for the night, I just wanted to let you know about a couple of things. Without you, the show doesn't take place. So, if you guys would like to support the show, or if you guys would like to get your hands on a couple of cool little things whenever new things come out, check out patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta, and any support that you guys show, I really appreciate. So everyone who's already donated to the Patreon, I really appreciate it. You guys are amazing. And thank you so much for that. If you guys are looking for more Creepypasta Storytime, there's a new video that's uploaded to this channel or uploaded to the podcast every Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday now. You can be able to get more from me at facebook.com/MrCreepyPasta or on Twitter at MrCreepyPasta and then the number 0. Thanks so much for listening, kids, and for your support. And sweet dreams.